Chapter 1296. Taking over the Egyptian dynasty was more complicated than expected. The surrender of the Egyptian dynasty was not won by Great Xia's military force. Great Xia did not even exert any pressure on the Egyptian dynasty, which left hidden dangers. Perhaps in the eyes of the Egyptian people, such surrender was more like betrayal. Fortunately, Great Xia had signed a legally binding agreement with the Egyptian dynasty, and there was no cheating. At 10 a.m. on the 18th of April, Great Xia's Vice Minister of Cabinet Ko Juan, together with Africa's protector, General Mulanyu, arrived in Cairo to officially take over Egypt. At this time, the defense of Cairo had been taken over by the Ravenous Wolf Army. The African Theater of Operations Command and the Ravenous Wolf Army General Headquarters were all moved to Cairo. There was no doubt that Cairo would become the central city of Great Xia in Africa. With the arrival of Mulanyu and her party in Cairo, the Egyptian dynasty was officially disbanded. The members of the royal family temporarily lived in the palace, but they would no longer appear or even take a step out of the palace. According to the arrangement of the Azure emblem, they would live in the territory of the Germanic dynasty in the future. A group of civil and military officials were also dismissed. Great Xia's strategy for ruling Egypt was to boil the frog in warm water. Therefore, whether it was the Egyptian court officials or local officials, the protector of Africa would keep them in office if they could. The strategy adopted by Great Xia was to maximize the use of local officials. In this way, the resistance of the Egyptian people to Great Xia would be much smaller, which was conducive to the smooth transition of power. After 2 or 3 years, this resistance would be quelled. Even then, it would be mainstream to use local officials. The African continent was not like the southern border. The recognition of the Chinese civilization was too low, and it was too difficult to forcibly assimilate. They could only plan slowly and try to rope in the local people. To put it in an inappropriate way, it would be using barbarians to control barbarians. In the capital, while Mulanyu and her party were taking over the Egyptian dynasty, the court was also studying the relevant personnel arrangements. In addition to the Sudan region being merged into the Sudan province, the newly established Egyptian province and Libyan province needed to send a governor to take office. In particular, the Egyptian governor was of utmost importance. The cabinet suggested that it was best to select one of the 5 existing governors in the Protectorate of Africa, as the 5 governors were familiar with the situation in Africa and could more easily play the role. Ouyang Shua agreed with the cabinet's suggestion. Among the 5 governors, Sudan's Governor Pei Yun and Kenya's Governor Chao were sent to Africa. The rest were Governor Du Sijing of Ethiopia, Governor Zhang Sun Wuji of Tanzania, and Governor Yang Xiuqing of Mozambique. Since Du Sijing had always been working under Mulanyu, in order to avoid suspicion, Ouyang Shua also excluded Du Sijing from this transfer. Furthermore, the strategic position of the Essex province was also very important and could not be separated from Du Sijing. Zhang Sun Wuji had just been transferred last year and was far from being familiar with the situation in Africa, so he was also excluded. As such, Yang Xiuqing became the only candidate. Ouyang Shua didn't hesitate and immediately decided to transfer Yang Xiuqing to Egypt's governor. This former core figure of the Taiping Heavenly Kingdom was also an old minister of the empire. He was conscientious and conscientious. Be it in talent or ability, he was the best of the best. Yang Xiuqing's experience in the Taiping Heavenly Kingdom also gave him the advantage of being good at comforting people. This was also a great help to him when he was in charge of the province of Egypt. As such, Ouyang Shua had no reason not to put Yang Xiuqing in an important position. The person who took over Governor Moses' position was the former governor of Xinyi County of North Chuan Province, south of Rosy Clouds. Under the background of the imperial court abolishing the prefectural government and increasing the number of counties, the rank of a county governor was actually decreasing. Being promoted from a county governor to a governor was really like a carp leaping through the Dragon's Gate. South of Rosy Clouds was the former lord of Rosy Cloud City and was also a core figure of the former Southern Siang City. Before he submitted to Great Xia, he even had a period of conflict and confrontation with Great Xia. Logically speaking, it was very difficult for such a person to be promoted. It was already very commendable for him to be able to hold his position as a county governor, let alone to be promoted to a provincial governor. Ouyang Shua made such a decision because south of Rosy Clouds had managed Xingyi County well in the past few years. As a lord, south of Rosy Clouds could at least prove that he had the ability to get to where he was. Secondly, he could be considered to have bought his talents with 1,000 gold coins. Ouyang Shua wanted to convey a message to the lords that Great Xia didn't care about their past. As long as they worked hard after submitting to Great Xia, they would be put in an important position. The imperial court wouldn't look at them with colored glasses. Hao Jiansheng, the former Zhaoqing County governor of Lingnan Province, was promoted to the position of governor of Libya Province. Like Gu Xiuan and Zhou Haichun, Hao Jiansheng was also Ouyang Shua's favorite student. He was one of the best among the indigenous civil officials. Before becoming the Zhaoqing County governor, he was the head of construction in the territory. There was a reason why Hao Jiansheng was assigned to oversee Libya. More than 95% of Libya's territory was desert or semi-desert. Only the narrow plains along the northern coast could be used for farming and living. The land utilization rate was extremely low. However, Libya was adjacent to the Mediterranean Sea. Just this point alone was enough to attract Great Xia's attention. Needless to say, like Egypt, Libya was also rich in oil. This made its strategic position prominent. In addition, Tunisia, which was also included in the Libyan province, was located in the northernmost part of Africa. It was in the middle of the Mediterranean Sea route and was separated from Italy by the Tunis Strait. It was the only way to transport oil from the Middle East to Western Europe and the United States. Its geographical location was very important. The Atlantic Fleet would set up a naval base in Etna, Tunisia. After learning that Egypt had submitted to Great Xia, the Caesar dynasty's extreme reaction was not without reason. When the Atlantic Fleet returned to the Mediterranean Sea, the Caesar dynasty's fleet would be in big trouble. Controlling the Tunis Strait was equivalent to controlling the Mediterranean Sea route. In addition, the Strait of Gibraltar and the Suez Canal were both under Great Xia's control. Basically, it could be said that Great Xia had already controlled the core of the Mediterranean Sea trade. Such a Libyan province was definitely worth Ouyang Shua sending his trusted officials to guard. Back then, Old Qin didn't dare to make the decision and ceded the Egyptian dynasty to Great Xia because he was worried about this. The sad thing was that although the Egyptian dynasty controlled the Suez Canal and Tunis, they didn't have a navy. They could only look on helplessly and surrender their maritime rights. In the end, it was Great Xia who benefited. In mid-April, just as Great Xia was methodically taking over the Egyptian dynasty, the 500,000 soldiers of the Egyptian dynasty were quietly gathering and stationed outside Cairo. On the 22nd of April, the 500,000 soldiers of the Egyptian dynasty entered Cairo under the cover of night. After disappearing through the teleportation portal, they appeared in the base city, which was thousands of kilometers away. According to the rules of the game, the Egyptian dynasty had submitted to Great Xia, so the 500,000 soldiers of the Egyptian dynasty naturally belonged to the Great Xia army. Thus, they could use the teleportation portal in Great Xia. As a result, the teleportation from Cairo to the base city was realized. The next morning, the 500,000 soldiers of the Egyptian dynasty landed in the Spanish dynasty under the protection of the second formation of the Atlantic Fleet stationed at the port of Gibraltar. This marked the beginning of the Egyptian dynasty's conquest of the Spanish dynasty. At the same time, Great Xia's North African army, which had just entered the Libyan province, took advantage of the situation to advance westward and attack the Algerian region, which had already been included in the Spanish dynasty's rule. The North African Army's slogan was revenge. Ouyang Shua didn't forget that the Silver Hand and the Azure Badge had used the shell of Algeria to force Great Xia to abandon the Morocco province. 2 years later, Great Xia came to take revenge. On the 24th of April, according to the agreement, after purchasing a batch of firearms, the Indian Empire launched a counterattack against the Argentine region controlled by the Spanish dynasty. For a time, the Spanish dynasty was besieged on all sides. Chapter 1297. The war in Europe could affect the situation as a whole. Faced with the attack of Great Xia, Egypt, and the Indian Empire, the Spanish dynasty was anxious. April 25th, Tortosa City. King Casillas of Spain urgently summoned the three generals for a video conference. The three generals were Duke Alva, also known as the Bloody Butcher Fernando, who was known as the Spanish god of war and the commander-in-chief of the Spanish army. He had personally led 250,000 troops to attack the Germanic dynasty. Don Juan, the half-brother of Philip II, was the commander of the Spanish Invincible Fleet. Alexander Farnese, the Duke of Parma, was the military commander of the Argentine region of the Spanish dynasty. He had also led 250,000 troops against the Indian Empire. The Spanish dynasty included the former Spain, Portugal, Morocco, Algeria, and Argentina, as well as Western Sahara and Mauritania, which had just been occupied. The total number of players in the territory was about 15 million. Among the 6 major European dynasties, its population was second only to the Germanic Empire. In addition to the Invincible Fleet, the Spanish dynasty had 750,000 regular troops divided into 3 armies. In addition to Fernando and Alexander, the remaining 250,000 troops were personally controlled by King Casillas to guard the mainland and African territories. Among them, 150,000 were stationed in the mainland, and the remaining 100,000 were scattered in 4 regions: Morocco, Algeria, Western Sahara, and Mauritania. Faced with the invasion of 3 enemy armies, Spain had no advantage in any of them. They had to face enemies that were several times their size. Their only advantage was that they had the advantage of being able to defend at home. "Tell me, what should we do?" Casillas asked. Bloody Butcher Fernando was the first to speak. "There are 3 enemy armies. The Great Xia army has the least number of soldiers, but they are the strongest. They are also facing our weakest defense. I suggest that the 100,000 troops stationed in Africa be transferred to the Algerian region to delay the pace of the Great Xia army's attack and buy time for the other battlefields. If necessary, we can recruit soldiers locally in Africa. Can we just give up the African territory?" Casillas was a little afraid of Great Xia. There are only 150,000 soldiers in the mainland. They definitely can't stop the attack of 500,000 Egyptian soldiers. Fernando shook his head. "Your Majesty, the African territory is the strongest barrier in the south of the kingdom. If we give up Africa, it is equivalent to completely exposing the mainland to the enemy, and it will only make the situation worse. There's one more thing. The 500,000 Egyptian troops are attacking our territory from the base city, so it'll be difficult for us to resupply them. If we give up on the African territory, it'll be equivalent to creating a huge rear for the Egyptian troops to resupply. Therefore, not only can we not easily give up the African territory, we must also hold on to it." After pausing for a moment, Fernando continued, "Instead of giving up the African territory, it's better to give up the Argentine region. Anyway, it's just an enclave and not worth much." A long time ago, Fernando had been dissatisfied with the kingdom's expenditure of precious troops on the South American continent. Now, he finally had the opportunity to ask His Majesty to withdraw from South America. No. What surprised Fernando was that not only did Alexander reject the proposal, but even His Majesty, who had been worried about the homeland, rejected it decisively. Alexander's objection was within Fernando's expectations. Alexander was the governor and military commander of Argentina. In Argentina, he was equivalent to half an uncrowned king. Naturally, he did not want the kingdom to withdraw its troops from Argentina. Fernando was puzzled by His Majesty's objection. It could only be said that Fernando did not understand King Casillas. Casillas's rise was quite legendary, and it was entirely due to the Silver Hand and Azure Badge's joint suppression of Great Xia, forcing Great Xia to abandon the Morocco province. The Spanish dynasty was the first to benefit from the favorable position and picked up Morocco and Algeria for free. With these 2 places, the Spanish dynasty which had always been inconspicuous, rose all the way as if it had the help of God. Not only did it prosper on the African continent, but it also took over the Argentine region in one fell swoop. The dynasty's territory set foot in Europe, Africa, and the Americas, and there was a hint of a global empire. This was Casillas' greatest pride and the most glorious moment in his life. His status in Europe had surpassed the three lords of Europe, Henry, William, and Caesar, who had previously enjoyed boundless glory. He was now on an equal footing with King Manstein of the Germanic dynasty. Within the Silver Hand, the status of the Casillas family had also risen. It could even be said that, taking advantage of the opportunity of working together with the Dawson dynasty in South America to balance the Indian Empire, the Casillas family successfully came together with the Dawson family and was about to enter the core of the Silver Hand. Under such circumstances, how could Casillas easily give up the Argentine region? Once it was abandoned, coupled with the African territory that might not be able to be preserved, the powerful Spanish dynasty would be beaten back to its original state and once again fall to the bottom of Europe. This was something that Casillas could not tolerate no matter what. "So what does your majesty mean?" Fernando asked, already having a bad premonition in his heart. Hearing this, Casillas slowly raised his head with a firm gaze. "Withdraw from Germanic." What responded to him was a deathly silence. After a long time, Fernando spoke. "Your Majesty, have you thought about the consequences of withdrawing?" This time, the Five Dynasties' encirclement and suppression of Germanic was the largest military operation in the history of the Silver Hand. They could only succeed, not fail. If the Spanish dynasty withdrew at this juncture, how would they explain it to the organization? Without the protection of the Silver Hand, even if the Spanish dynasty could escape this disaster, in the future in the game world, could they continue to resist the impact of a giant like Sia? Therefore, in Fernando's opinion, this was a very short-sighted decision. Even Alexander, who advocated not withdrawing from Argentina, did not agree with His Majesty's decision. "If we don't withdraw, what else can we do?" Casillas was a little annoyed. "We can't even protect ourselves. Do we still have to work for the organization?" This was really unreasonable. Fernando and the others actually understood Casillas' internal logic. This time, the Silver Hand besieged the Germanic dynasty. Even if they won, there was still a Gaul dynasty between Germanic and Spain had already taken advantage of Morocco and Algeria. In the future, the division of Germanic territory would naturally have nothing to do with the Spanish dynasty. In other words, the Spanish dynasty's expedition this time was only to fulfill its obligations, and there was no benefit. Therefore, Casillas chose to withdraw from the Germanic battlefield in order to consolidate the home defense and deal with the invading Egyptian army. Besides, withdrawing the army to fight the Egyptian army is also to share the burden of the organization. If the Egyptian army is allowed to march straight in, the Germanic battlefield will also change, Casillas argued. This made some sense. Anyone with a discerning eye could see that the Azure badge reluctantly ceded the Egyptian dynasty to Sia. In addition to expecting Sia to intervene in the European battlefield, it also had the idea of liberating the Egyptian army. The intention of using the Egyptian army to coordinate with the Germanic dynasty was very obvious. It could be said that the moment the Egyptian army landed in Spain, the Spanish mainland also became a part of the European battlefield. Fernando said, "Your Majesty, I think it's better to discuss the withdrawal with the Allies." Casillas heard this and nodded. Chapter 1298. The 8th Year of Gaia, April 26th. Following Casillas' proposal, the Silver Hand initiated a six-nation summit. Of these 6 people, in addition to King William of Gondor, King Casillas of Spain, King Henry of Gaul, King Caesar of Caesar, and King Pushkin of Romanov, the remaining was naturally King Jack of Freedom. From this, it could be seen that the Dawson dynasty had a transcendent position within the Silver Hand. Jack and the others had already learned about the attack on Spain, so when Casillas called for a video conference, they quickly responded. "Cassie, are you able to hold on? Do you need help from the organization?" As Casillas' big backer, Jack was giving Casillas a way to step down as soon as he spoke. This was Jack's charm. "It's a bit difficult. I'm worried that once the Egyptian army breaks out of Spain, it will affect the main battlefield. Cassius was not an idiot, and he did not mention the matter of withdrawal at first. It shouldn't be. It was Henry who spoke. Because the Gaul dynasty and the Spanish dynasty were next to each other, the relationship between Henry and Cassius was very subtle. When Ouyang Shuo first sailed to the Mediterranean Sea, Henry also used the east wind of Great Xia to trap Spain once, allowing the Gaul fleet to successfully break out and officially set foot in the Mediterranean Sea. At one time, in order to solve the predicament of the dynasty, Henry also thought about whether to rely on Great Xia and join forces to divide Spain. Fortunately, Henry was forbearing enough and did not implement it in the end. The Spanish army is said to have millions of soldiers. I believe that a mere 500,000 Egyptian army, coupled with the exhaustion of the expedition and the lack of logistical supplies, will definitely not be able to cause any trouble. Henry did not hesitate to raise Spain's prestige in his words, because he was worried that Cassius would cheat and use the reason that the enemy was too strong to divert the disaster and let the Egyptian army into the territory of Gaul. It could only be said that Henry thought a little too much. Cassius was very proud, very much like the Spanish, but he was not so vicious. In contrast, Henry was a dog that did not bark, but when he bit someone, it really hurt. The Spanish army is not small, but the territory is wider, and troops have to be stationed everywhere, unlike some dynasties that only guard an acre of land. Cassius was not the type to admit defeat. Henry listened. His face did not change, but his hands were clenched into fists. Being surpassed by a nobody like Cassius was the biggest scar in Henry's heart, and it was still bleeding. He had schemed all his life, but he could not compare to Cassius. Seeing this, Jack stepped forward to help. Now is not the time to be impulsive. Spain was attacked, and the root cause is Great Xia. We must not be careless. William nodded in agreement. Let's discuss a solution. Great Xia is not easy to deal with. William was very active in eliminating the hidden danger of the Germanic dynasty, because this was related to the future strategic security of the Steel dynasty. If they won this battle, the Ganger dynasty could basically rest easy. For this, William did not hesitate to send nearly half of the Ganger dynasty's army to participate in the battle. This was a very bold move. After all, the future division of the Germanic dynasty would still be dominated by the Romanov dynasty, the Gaul dynasty, and the Caesar dynasty. It would be difficult for the Ganger dynasty to gain an advantage because it was across the sea from the European continent. On this point, the inland dynasties of Europe had a tacit understanding that they would not allow the Ganger dynasty to get involved. Jack said, "In South America, Dawson will join forces with the Brasilia dynasty to exert pressure on the eastern border of the Indian Empire. Casey, if necessary, you can transfer some of your troops from Argentina back to the mainland." Cassius was a little hesitant. This was not what he had imagined. Don't worry. The Argentine region will not be lost. If necessary, the Dawson dynasty will personally send troops to defend the Argentine region for you. Jack had to make a promise. And according to the intelligence, the Indian Empire's display of power this time is just to purchase a batch of firearms that Great Xia has eliminated. There is nothing to worry about at all. Although he said this, Jack was still very envious of Great Xia's arms trade. Seeing that Jack had said this, Cassius naturally went along with the flow. Okay, I will transfer 50,000 troops from Argentina back to the mainland to assist in the defense, but this is far from enough. In addition to the mainland, the situation in the African territory is more tense. I am worried that with only 100,000 troops, it is impossible to stop the attack of Great Xia. Once Great Xia captures Morocco, the consequences will be unimaginable. Cassius was very smart. He followed Fernando's analysis and used it as a bargaining chip, because he suddenly realized that this crisis, if handled well, might also be an opportunity. This thought flashed in Cassius's mind. Jack listened to Cassius's complaints and looked at Henry and Caesar. Can the troops of Gaul and the Caesar dynasty stationed in Africa assist in the defense? In West Africa, the Spanish dynasty had the largest territory, followed by the Germanic dynasty, then the Caesar dynasty and the Gaul dynasty. As for the Ganger dynasty, as mentioned previously, they returned in failure. Needless to say, the Romanov dynasty was too far away and had not set foot on the African continent at all. We will try our best. Henry and Caesar's faces were a little ugly. Obviously, they were unwilling to do such a thankless thing. Seeing that the situation was unfavorable, Henry said maliciously, "Although I can't help much in the African battlefield, but if the Spanish mainland needs it, I can send a support force, as long as Spain is responsible for logistics." "Thank you, but no need." Cassius was expressionless and directly refused. Whether it was out of face or practical considerations, Cassius would never allow the Gaul army to set foot on the Spanish territory. Who knew what they were planning when they came? When it comes to logistics, there is one thing that the Gaul dynasty can help with. Cassius quickly found an opportunity to counterattack, pretending to be relaxed, and said, "Given that the Spanish mainland is in a war, there is no energy to take care of the front line. The logistical supply of the Spanish army needs to be solved by the Gaul dynasty." According to the alliance agreement, each army had to be responsible for its own provisions. For example, the provisions of the Ganger army were transported from the mainland to Gaul by sea, and then the Gaul people were responsible for transporting the provisions to the front line. Otherwise, the Gaul dynasty alone could not support the logistics of the army. Just transporting provisions for the Ganger army and the Spanish army was already too much for the Gaul dynasty. On this point, Henry had never complained and seemed to have a good view of the overall situation. Now, seeing that Cassius actually took the opportunity to shamelessly ask the Gaul dynasty to solve the food problem for the Spanish army, Henry's face turned green with anger. Cassius was calm and said lightly, "If the Gaul dynasty can't do it, then I have to withdraw the army from the front line. I can't let the army fight on an empty stomach." The expressions of the others were stagnant. In the end, it was still Cassius who said the most embarrassing solution. The Romanov king, Pushkin, who had been silent all this time, said with a gloomy face, "It's impossible for the Spanish army to withdraw. It might cause the good situation to go down the drain." According to the rough location, the alliance could be divided into the Western Army, the Southern Army, and the Eastern Army. The Western Army, which was the allied army of Spain, Gaul, and the Ganger dynasty, had a total of 750,000 troops, including 250,000 Spanish troops, 300,000 Gallic troops, and 200,000 Ganger troops. The Southern Army, which was the Caesar army, could only support 400,000 troops because of the obstruction of the Alps and the difficulty in transporting provisions. Even so, in view of the Great Sia's return to the Mediterranean Sea, which seriously threatened the safety of the Caesar dynasty, Caesar was still prepared to withdraw some troops from the front line. The Eastern Army, which was the Romanov army, had a total of 500,000 troops. It was also the dynasty with the largest number of troops. Of course, if they won this battle, the Romanov dynasty would also be the most generous reward. The total strength of the alliance was 1.65 million, and their enemy, the Germanic dynasty, had a conventional army of 1.5 million before the war started. After the war started, they had been conscripting troops. It was expected that their strength would increase rapidly. The combat power of both sides could be said to be evenly matched. Under the premise that the Spanish army did not withdraw, the alliance would probably have to send more troops to the battlefield in the future to win this war of the century. In William's words, "We have to be prepared for a war that will destroy the country." If the Spanish army were to withdraw at this time, the strength of both sides would be reversed. Moreover, the Germanic dynasty was fighting in their own territory. At that time, it would be really hard to say who would fight who. Therefore, Pushkin and the others would never allow the Spanish army to withdraw. "Then, what do you think I should do?" Cassius suddenly became very calm. "The Spanish mainland is attacked on 3 sides. How can they still care about the front line?" Chapter 1299. Faced with Cassius's threat, Jack and the others could only persuade Henry to help solve the food problem for the Spanish army. Although Henry agreed, his face was gloomy. At the same time, in order to interfere with the logistics of the Egyptian army, the meeting also reached an agreement to request the Gallic and Caesar fleets to cooperate with the Spanish Invincible Fleet to strengthen control of the Mediterranean Sea. The logistics of the Egyptian army could be roughly divided into three categories. The first category was the food stored by Great Sia in the base cities. The food stored in the granaries of the base cities was basically from the Morocco province. After such a long period of consumption, there was actually not much left. The second category was looting in the Spanish mainland. Because of this, the people of the entire southern region of Spain suffered. In order to collect food for the army, the Egyptian army did everything possible. But with Spain on guard, this method was rather unstable. The third category was the food transported by the Atlantic fleet from the port of Tunis. When the Azure Emblem signed the Egyptian dynasty's cession agreement with Great Sia, one of the terms was that before the Egyptian army gained a foothold in the European battlefield, Great Sia had to be responsible for the Egyptian army's food supplies. This food was originally stored by the Egyptian dynasty, so Ouyang Shua had no reason to refuse. In order to fulfill the agreement, the Atlantic Fleet's Admiral Zhou Yu immediately started making arrangements after leading the first fleet to the Gulf of Aden and raising the Atlantic Fleet's designation. What the Allies had to do now was to let the three fleets work together to cut off the most important food supply route of the Egyptian army, so that the Egyptian army at the front lines would collapse. It was indeed a good plan to seize the Egyptian army's most fatal weakness. After Cassius finished complaining, Caesar also said, Egypt's submission will allow Great Sia to return to the Mediterranean Sea and become a direct threat to the Caesar dynasty. In the future, it will be difficult for me to increase my troops on the German battlefield. Compared to Cassius, Caesar was much more straightforward. Italy was the core of the Caesar dynasty, and it was also the closest place to Great Sia, separated only by the Strait of Tunis. How could Caesar not be nervous? I think there's no need to fear Great Sia, said Jack. The one who spoke was Jack. Great Sia only has 1 million soldiers in Africa, yet they have to guard East and North Africa. The Egyptian dynasty has just submitted and has a lot of internal problems. Great Sia can't even deal with its internal affairs. How can we rashly provoke the Caesar dynasty at this time? Caesar, however, disagreed. He said mockingly, It's easy for you to say that. Apart from Africa, Great Sia has 4 to 5 million soldiers. What's so difficult about teleporting a few over? Caesar was probably the only one who dared to talk to Jack like that. Then you do as you see fit. Jack was also angry. He was kind enough to mediate the European battlefield, but he did not want to be bullied. When the others saw this, they didn't dare to interrupt. Because of this small interlude, the summit meeting came to an end in such an awkward atmosphere. April 28th, South America. Jack fulfilled his promise. On this day, half of the Dawson dynasty's army stationed in Colombia, a total of 200,000 soldiers, joined forces with the 400,000 soldiers of the Brasilia dynasty to initiate a war against the Indian Empire. The Indian Empire once again fell into the predicament of fighting on two fronts. This almost became a dead knot. Seeing this, Cassius decisively transferred back 50,000 troops from the Argentina region to defend the mainland. Finally, the situation in the mainland was slightly stabilized, and the Egyptian army was blocked in the south. The war in Spain seemed to be gradually stabilizing. In the face of the siege, this time, Juarez was determined to attack the Argentina region first, and then focus on dealing with the Brasilia dynasty, so as to avoid falling into the predicament of fighting on two fronts for a long time. While arranging for the army to defend the east, the Indian Empire strengthened its attack on the south. All of South America was dragged into the flames of war. Only Great Sia's Shao County in South America still maintained a rare peace, like a pure land. This time, Juarez really went all out. He once again placed an order of 20 million gold coins for firearms from Great Sia. He bluntly said that he wanted the most advanced flintlocks and cannons. The two large arms orders had almost emptied the financial reserves of the Indian Empire last year. In the face of such an order, Ouyang Shua naturally did not refuse. In the dozens of newly industrialized cities selected by the imperial court as priorities for development, military factories rose from the ground one after another. A huge amount of coal, iron, ore, and other resources were continuously transported to these cities through water and sea, turning into tons of steel, which were then turned into flintlocks and cannons. With the help of developed sea transportation, they were sold all over the world. With the help of the 3 firearms orders, the industrialization of these cities was ushering in a leap. In order to realize train transportation as soon as possible, improve the transportation efficiency of coal and other resources, and meet the support needs of these cities, the railway network planned by the court was also in the process of construction. The 3 orders, together with the funds earned from the sale of obsolete firearms, totaled more than 76 million gold coins. Other than the funds used for the construction of the city's factories, the rest were all invested into the railway construction. In other words, Great Xia was using the money of other dynasties to build its own industrial facilities. Coupled with the huge amount of special funding from the court, the speed of the railway construction was calculated in days. With the help of fuzzy processing, the railway network was expanding every day. A new construction miracle was happening in the territory of Great Xia. The former construction maniac seemed to be repeating a construction miracle in the game world. Soon it was May, in the Mediterranean Sea. Just as smoke rose in South America, the Spanish Invincible Fleet, the Gallic Fleet, and the Caesar Fleet launched a joint patrol in the Mediterranean Sea, interfering with the Atlantic Fleet supply line. For a time, the Mediterranean Sea, which was usually prosperous with trade, became jittery. A large number of merchant ships were forced to dock in the surrounding ports, no longer daring to travel on the sea. This was because there was news that yesterday, a merchant fleet was detained by the Allied fleet for colluding with the enemy. The maritime trade of the European and American dynasties suffered a heavy setback. Only a few greedy merchants, seeing the flames of war burning in Europe, wanted to take the opportunity to make a fortune from the war, dared to take the risk, and continue to travel through the Mediterranean Sea. Under such circumstances, if they succeeded, they would indeed make a lot of money. During times of war, resources were always more expensive than usual. Of course, there was also a group of merchants who dared to continue doing business, and that was the merchant fleets that had connections with the 3 major fleets. They could obtain the protection of the 3 major fleets, so naturally, they had nothing to fear. For a time, the number of merchant fleets that took the initiative to pay their respects to the 3 major fleets soared. For the 3 major fleets, this was a pleasant surprise. For the first time, they tasted the sweetness of monopolizing the sea route, so they acted more and more unscrupulously. In the end, even the boldest merchants dared not take the risk. All merchant fleets that wanted to travel through the Mediterranean Sea had to pay tribute to the 3 major fleets. The merchant fleets colluded with the fleets and successfully monopolized the Mediterranean Sea route. In the process, they seemed to have neglected one thing, and that was the presence of the Great Xia Atlantic Fleet in the Mediterranean Sea seemed to be getting smaller and smaller, almost becoming invisible. Another summit of the 5 nations was held. This time, they were discussing the seizure of merchant ships that had just happened. The course of the matter was actually very simple. It was just that the Caesar fleet had been possessed, and in the name of escort inspection, they embezzled, seized merchant ships, and took advantage of the chaos to fill their own pockets. As the saying went, if an army robbed, even a god could not stop it. Caesar, you must give us an explanation. The one who spoke was William. The blockade of the Mediterranean Sea route had the greatest impact on the Steele dynasty. So how could William not be angry? Caesar, however, was not afraid. He calmly said, "What is there to explain? The Great Xia transported supplies to the front lines through merchant ships. Who can guarantee that every inspection will be correct? It is very normal to misjudge once." In fact, the behavior of the Caesar fleet had been privately instructed by Caesar. This greedy guy just wanted to take the opportunity to make a fortune from the war. Anyway, the Caesar dynasty was located in the eastern part of the Mediterranean Sea. Even if the route was blocked, it would not affect the Caesar dynasty much. On the contrary, because the route was blocked, The merchant ships that were originally going to the Steel Dynasty or the Germanic Dynasty could only stop at the port of the Caesar Dynasty and sell on the spot, which instead promoted the trade of the Caesar Dynasty. This deal, no matter how one looked at it, was worth it. However, what the initiator, Caesar, did not expect was that the accidental seizure of a ship would cause a chain reaction and create a new monopoly on the Mediterranean Sea route. Caesar found that accepting tribute from the merchant fleet was more profitable than simple and crude seizure. William was so angry at Caesar's shameless behavior that he could not speak. "Tell me, how should we deal with this matter?" Seeing that Caesar was stubborn, William could only ask for help from Henry and the others. Strangely, Cassius and Henry did not say a word. Cassius was nervous about the war at home. Even without this incident, the overseas trade of the Spanish mainland had stopped a long time ago. He still had to rely on the Caesar fleet to snipe the Atlantic fleet. How could he stand up at this time and embarrass the Caesar fleet? Henry, on the other hand, was resentful after the last meeting and did not say a word throughout the whole process. Moreover, the two of them were also considered to be beneficiaries of this. Wasn't it a slap in the face to stand up and condemn Caesar at this time? There seemed to be some kind of tacit understanding between the three of them. They wanted to use this European war to make a lot of money. As for Pushkin, the Romanov dynasty did not rely on the Mediterranean Sea route and stayed out of it. Of course, he would not stand up for William. Under William's intense gaze, Pushkin reluctantly said, "I think, if we can use this to cut off the trade channel of the Germanic dynasty, it will also be beneficial for the front line." William only felt his hands and feet turn cold when he saw this. Only then did he realize that without Jack in charge, the 5 major European dynasties simply had their own thoughts. It was not an exaggeration to say that they were in a state of disunity. As for William, he really had no prestige in Europe. Desolate. Chapter 1300. William's efforts were all for naught. As the Mediterranean Sea route was blocked, the Ganger Empire became the biggest victim. The price of all goods sold to the Ganger Empire had at least doubled. In the Ganger Empire, prices rose rapidly, and the people complained incessantly. Spain, Gaul, and the Caesar Empire stepped on the corpse of the Ganger Empire and made a lot of money. William's accusation was not convincing. After all, the joint inspection of the 3 fleets was a plan they had agreed on, and the action of the 3 fleets, in fact, had indeed impacted the Germanic Empire. The suffering of the Ganger Empire would only be worse for the Germanic Empire. In the end, this matter could only come to an end. William suffered a loss and could only learn from Henry and silently endure. He only hoped that the Allies could quickly conquer the Germanic Empire and give the Ganger Empire a safe strategic space. May 5th, the capital. In this round of World War, the Great Xia seemed to have no sense of existence, but it also seemed to be everywhere. It was like a giant beast, silently watching the dynasties in the darkness, patiently waiting for the best time to hunt. At this time, Ouyang Shua could also be like the master of the silver hand or the azure emblem, a chess piece that had no choice but to beautifully turn around and become a chess player that had control over the world. Although Ouyang Shua was a newcomer, his ability was extraordinary. The ministers in the court found that His Majesty had become more and more relaxed, with a very leisurely atmosphere. He no longer bent over the table all day reading memorials. Most of the time, he seemed to be very idle. Like now, in May, the temperature in the capital had completely warmed up. In the Imperial Garden, the sun was shining brightly, hundreds of flowers were blooming, birds were singing, and on the green grass, on the swing covered with morning glories, the crisp laughter of a girl could be heard. That was the Empire's little princess, Ouyang Luo. In 10 days, she would be 3 years old. This was the most playful and naughty age of her life. Her white skirt and black hair fluttered in the wind, like a fairy of nature. The one who pushed the swing was Ouyang Shua. At this time, Ouyang Shua was no longer a decisive, iron-blooded emperor who made his enemies afraid. He was just a father who doted on his children and played with them, with a doting smile on his face. Not far away, under the supervision of Grand Guardian Wang Feng, Yu began to practice the most basic martial arts training. Although his young and tender face was covered with sweat, but he revealed a stubborn and unyielding spirit. Yu's temperament was exactly the same as Ouyang Shuo when he was young. Beside Ouyang Shuo stood a minister, Du Ruhui. Du Ruhui didn't seem surprised at all by such a scene. She stood calmly at the side and reported the war situation in South America, Africa, and Europe. Du Ruhui knew that although the emperor was focused on pushing the swing and did not even look at him, every word he said was clearly heard by the emperor. If there was even the slightest mistake in the report, His Majesty would inadvertently turn around and give Du Ruhui a look. Even someone as calm as Du Ruhui would unconsciously become nervous when His Majesty looked at her so lightly. Therefore, every minister who rushed to the imperial garden to report was very careful. However, he could not show his nervousness. After all, the eldest son of the emperor and the little princess of the empire were standing at the side. He could not afford to lose his composure in front of them. Therefore, every time before rushing to report, the ministers would think twice to ensure that nothing went wrong. After Du Ruhui finished his report, Ouyang Shuo did not turn around and said indifferently, "Good. The fish has taken the bait. Tell Han Xian that he can set off. He can decide how to carry out the specific actions." Du Ruhui nodded and asked, "Your Majesty, how should we reply to the African side?" "Wait a little longer. The fire is not ready yet. Let them waste a little more time." Ouyang Shuo did not seem to realize that just because of this sentence of his, it was unknown how many people would continue to suffer the pain of war. Or perhaps he realized it, but did not do anything. Du Ruhui said, "The azure emblem is very dissatisfied with the efficiency of our grain transportation. This humble minister is worried that if we continue to delay, it will affect the cooperation between the two sides." "Don't worry, they can still hold on. It's not just that." Ouyang Shuo was as clear as a blazing fire. "Understood." Du Ruhui saw this and timely stopped. After finishing his report and receiving clear instructions, Du Ruhui bid farewell and left. As the Minister of Internal Affairs of the Empire, he was really very busy. Not far away, he heard the clear laughter of the little princess. This laughter was contagious and gave people strength. The corner of Du Ruhui's mouth inadvertently revealed a trace of a smile. In his view, this was the sign of a prosperous empire. His footsteps became more and more determined. On the 6th of May, after receiving the order, Han Xian quietly teleported with the stalwart Tiger Army to Shao County. The next day, the North American Army, led by General Shui, also teleported from the southern border to Shao County. At this point, the three major armies of the American theater of war had successfully met in Shao County. The small Shao County suddenly gathered 75 elite troops and stationed outside Fulcrum City, which was very eye-catching. This also meant that the flames of war in South America would burn more and more fiercely. Fulcrum City, the temporary headquarters of the American theater of war. General Han Xian raised his tent for the first time to discuss matters. The commanders of the three major armies and above were all present. "This time, we will meet in Fulcrum City. Needless to say, the purpose is to open up territory in South America for the Empire. Our first target is the nearby Columbia region and drive the Dawson dynasty out of South America." Han Xian's words were very clear at the beginning. When the generals heard this, their eyes lit up and their expressions were excited, revealing an expression of eagerness. However, Han Xian deliberately paused for a moment and looked around at the generals with a threatening gaze. Even the brave Shui, Rangui, unconsciously restrained his expression and put on a look of attentiveness. Now is not the time to attack. Everyone, you must restrain your subordinates. Without orders, no one is allowed to take a step out of the camp. Behave yourself, understand? Han Xian asked loudly. Understood. The generals answered in unison subconsciously. At the last moment, they cautiously asked, Commander-in-Chief, there are only 200,000 enemy troops in the Columbia region. They're no match for us at all. Shouldn't we attack immediately? Han Xian could be considered to have a good temper. He explained, if it's just attacking Colombia, there naturally won't be any problem at all. If the command is right, we only need to mobilize one army to settle the battle. This was Han Xian's confidence. But are you only satisfied with a small Colombia? Han Xian asked. Hearing this, the eyes of the generals who had just been listless immediately lit up, and their gazes became even more fiery. The blood in their bodies was unconsciously boiling. What do you mean, Commander-in-Chief? The generals asked. Han Xian sat up straight with a solemn expression, as if he had a great mission. He said with emotion, conquering the Brasilia dynasty for the empire and dividing South America with the Indian Empire is what we should do. Yes, Commander-in-Chief. The generals no longer hesitated. They saluted one by one to express their approval and loyalty to the Commander-in-Chief. Han Xian nodded. After the generals returned to their positions, he said, at present, the Brasilia dynasty has sent 400,000 troops to attack the Indian Empire. Once we intervene now, the Brasilia dynasty's army may retreat to their homeland and alert the enemy. Only when the war between the two sides is in a stalemate and neither side can easily get away will it be a good opportunity for us to attack. So, what we have to do now is to stay in the camp with peace of mind, adapt to the climate of South America, and familiarize ourselves with the terrain of South America. We have to make the final preparations for the upcoming war, understand? Yes. The generals saluted again. There are some things that Han Xian couldn't say too clearly. His Majesty had given him the right to make arbitrary decisions in South America, so he must shoulder the responsibility and not let His Majesty down. As a godly general, Han Xian not only saw the battlefield itself, but also the post-war situation. Once the Great Xia army successively conquered the Colombian and Brasilia dynasties, then the entire South American continent would probably be left with only the Great Xia and the Indian Empire. At that time, would the Indian Empire still follow Great Xia's lead? Not necessarily. There was no limit to human ambition. Without the threat of foreign enemies, the Indian Empire would never be grateful to Great Xia for getting rid of their mortal enemies and returning them a peaceful and prosperous era. On the contrary, for the Indian king, Juarez, it was more likely that he resented Great Xia from the bottom of his heart for occupying the South American continent that should have belonged to him. After all, Juarez had regarded South America as his backyard as early as 2 years ago. The relationship between the two dynasties was bound to be very awkward at that time. Under such a premise, using the army of Brasilia and the army of the Dawson dynasty to weaken the strength of the Indian Empire was the best move. Many times, hatred also had to be supported by strength. Chapter 1301. On the 10th day of the 5th month of the 8th year of Gaia, just as the entire world was plunged into an ongoing chaotic war, an inconspicuous piece of news caught Ouyang Shua's attention. At 10 in the morning, the Dawson dynasty and the Dark Knight Empire issued a joint declaration, formally forming a trading partnership. The Dark Knight Empire, which had been dormant for several months, finally took its first step into global affairs. It wasn't surprising at all that the Dark Knight Empire had chosen the Dawson dynasty as their partner. Due to the location of the motherland, the sea route between the Dark Knight Empire and the Dawson dynasty was even shorter than the Atlantic Ocean route. As the two sides began to engage in trade, it meant that the crystallization of the motherland civilization would flow into the Dawson dynasty. With the support of the Dawson dynasty, the Dark Knight Empire grew more and more confident. In the past few days, they had been constantly sending out fleets to harass the southern coast of the Grand Xia dynasty. The Southern Border Protectorate and the Nanyang War Zone displayed extraordinary resolve in the face of the Dark Knight Empire's disruption. They constantly strengthened their defenses along the coast, not giving the enemy any opportunities. In particular, he placed torpedoes in the port to prevent the Dark Knight fleet from entering the port. In this way, the Dark Knight fleet, which did not have a landing force, could only fight on the coast. Half a month had passed, and the South American battlefield was in a stalemate. The Indian Empire sent their main forces into the southern battlefield. In the east, the Dawson dynasty and the Brasilia dynasty's 600,000-strong allied army swept through, advancing triumphantly and causing the Indian Empire great losses. May 15th, Owa County, Fulcrum City. Han Xin, who had been paying attention to the situation in South America, once again raised his tent to discuss the matter. Looking at the map of South America, Han Xin analyzed, Colombia is north of the county. Our army can march all the way north and take control of the Panama area and the Panama Canal. The Panama Canal was an important waterway connecting the Pacific and Atlantic Oceans. Following the Egyptian dynasty's surrender, Great Xia entered the Mediterranean Sea and controlled the Suez Canal. The Panama Canal became the only key waterway that was not under Great Xia's control. The Panama Canal was also the choke point between the eastern and western seacoasts of the Dawson dynasty. It was the lifeline of the Dawson dynasty. Thus, long ago, the Dawson dynasty had conquered Panama and taken control of the canal. Even during this attack on the Indian Empire, the Dawson dynasty had stationed 150,000 of their 200,000 soldiers in the Panama region. From this, one could see how much importance the Dawson dynasty placed on this region. With that said, Han Xin began to call out names. Shui. Here. Shui quickly stepped forward and cupped his fists in excitement. I want you to lead the troops along the coast of Colombia and advance quickly until we capture Panama City, Han Xin ordered. Yes, Commander. Shui stepped forward and took the arrow. Remember, Panama City has an international teleportation array. Given the strategic importance of the Panama Canal, the Dawson dynasty can send an army to reinforce us at any time. Don't underestimate the enemy, Han Xin instructed. Understood. In fact, the Great Xia army already had a deep understanding of teleportation tactics. Han Xin changed the topic and said, according to our intelligence, the Dawson Empire has a total military strength of 5 million soldiers. Aside from the internal defense forces, they also have to deal with the attacks of the Maple Leaf Dynasty and Umayyad Dynasty from the north and south. Not to mention the troops stationed in Africa and the 400,000 soldiers already stationed in the Colombia area. The number of troops they can mobilize will not exceed 150,000. You don't have to worry too much. The territory of Dawson Empire was comparable to that of Great Xia. Unfortunately, the population of Dawson Empire was much larger than that of Great Xia, which limited the number of its armies. Otherwise, Jack would have long since expanded without restraint. Hearing this, Shui nodded again. His expression was already very calm. Han Xin turned his gaze to the map again. In addition to Panama City, the Colombia area has international teleportation arrays in Bogotá, Caracas, Georgetown, Paramaribo, and Quillán. Speaking of this, Han Xin also felt a headache. These teleportation arrays were located in the capital cities of Colombia, Venezuela, Guyana, Suriname, and Guyana. After the countries were destroyed by the Dawson dynasty, they naturally retained their international teleportation arrays. Apart from the capital city of Colombia, Bogotá, which was also the administrative center of the state of Colombia, located inland, the remaining 4 cities were coastal cities facing the Atlantic Ocean. Of course, if Great Xia attacked these areas, according to the rules of the game given by Gaia, since these areas were no longer independent game zones, the international teleportation arrays would be canceled one by one. For example, after the Indian Empire ceded the city of Quito to Great Xia, the teleportation array was canceled. It was Ouyang Shua who used a teleportation talisman to re-establish the teleportation array in Fulcrum City. If we take down these 5 cities, we will basically control the entire Colombia area. Speaking of this, Han Xin called out again, Li Xiuqing. Yes, General. The commander of the brave Tiger Army, the young general of the Eastern Expedition, Li Xiuqing, quickly stepped forward. You will lead the troops and take the middle route. You will be responsible for capturing Bogotá and Caracas. Yes, Commander. Li Xiuqing received the arrow of command with a solemn expression. These 2 cities were the former capital cities of Colombia and Venezuela respectively. They were also the 2 most magnificent capital cities. The commander had given him this important task, which clearly showed his trust in the brave Tiger Army. Han Xian instructed as usual, "Remember, the Central Army must be fast and try to end the battle as soon as possible. After capturing Bogota, arrange for a legion to be stationed there. The rest of the legions are to gather in Caracas." "Yes, General." Li Xiuqing's eyes flashed a trace of doubt. According to the usual practice, the brave Tiger Army should be stationed in Colombia. Why do they have to gather in Caracas? However, Li Xiuqing did not ask. He believed that the commander must have his reasons for making such an arrangement. As a soldier, he just needed to carry out the orders. Seeing this, Han Xian nodded in satisfaction and did not explain. He then said, "Battle Wolf." "Yes, General." The commander of the South American Army, General Battle Wolf of the Eastern Expedition, also stepped forward with a somewhat unnatural expression. It was easy to understand. Among the generals in the tent, Battle Wolf was the only mutant. Before he surrendered to the Great Xia dynasty, he was a tyrant. When had he ever been subservient to others? Now, Battle Wolf had no choice but to obey Han Xian's orders. Before Han Xian arrived in Ogwa County, Battle Wolf did not feel anything because he also held the position of provincial governor and had no one to restrict him. But now, Battle Wolf really needed to adjust. Needless to say, with the official establishment of the American Theater of Operations, Battle Wolf's position as the provincial governor of Shao County had also been removed by the imperial court and completely became history. In the future, Battle Wolf would only be a member of the American Theater of Operations. Other than that, he was nothing else. Han Xian, however, felt nothing and ordered, "Lead the troops and go straight to Georgetown, Palamaribo, and Qian. Don't stop along the way if you can. Speed is the most important thing in war." "Yes, General." Battle Wolf stepped forward and took the arrow of command. Chapter 1302. In the tent, Han Xian assigned the three armies their tasks. All of them seemed to be concentrated in the Columbia region, but he didn't mention anything about the other target, the Brasilia dynasty. This was puzzling. Han Xian didn't answer the questions of the generals either. He just told them to act according to plan. On the 16th of May, following Han Xian's order, the American war zone moved out in full force. The vast army passed through Fulcrum City, passed through the northern border of the county, and charged into the Columbia region. Behind the army was a long line of troops transporting provisions. These rations were all sent by the Indian Empire to offset the cost of arms. In order to transport the provisions to the front lines, Governor Zhou Haichun mobilized almost all the young men in the county. Dawson Dynasty, Liberty City. The news of the Great Xia's attack on Columbia was immediately transmitted to the capital. Jack's expression was solemn when he received the report. He muttered to himself, "The cunning Easterners actually made their move at this time. What a good plan." Right now, Jack didn't realize that the entire war in the Americas had the shadow of the Great Xia behind it. Ouyang Shua had planned for so long in order to seize the Panama Canal and choke the neck of the Dawson Dynasty in order to prepare for the next big move. How many troops can the kingdom send to support Colombia? Jack asked. Sitting in front of him was the prime minister of the Dawson Dynasty, Franklin. The Panama Canal was too important. Otherwise, the Dawson Dynasty wouldn't have stationed nearly 1/5 of the kingdom's troops in a single state. Thus, Jack subconsciously wanted to protect Colombia and the Panama Canal. Hearing this, Franklin replied, "At most, we can only send 100,000 troops." "So few?" Jack was surprised. In the past month, the Maple Dynasty in the north has been very stubborn. Instead of decreasing, their troops have increased. I suspect that it's because they recently obtained a batch of firearms. Franklin was very helpless. The Mayan Dynasty in the south is the same. Recently, they have been harassing the southern side of the kingdom very fiercely. More than half of the kingdom's troops have been sent to these two battlefields. Jack's expression was very ugly. Did you find out where they bought the firearms from? If there are no surprises, it should be the Great Xia. Only the Great Xia has the ability to sell so many firearms at once. Franklin was very certain. The Great Xia. It's the Great Xia again. Jack had a bad feeling as he chewed. We are fighting for our lives on the front lines, but Great Xia is profiting from the war. What a good scheme. Jack could faintly see the ghost of Great Xia hiding behind the scenes, and his mood became even more depressed. There was a huge reversal of history. It seems that we have to provoke the Dark Knight Empire and make it cause more trouble for Great Xia. Otherwise, Great Xia will become a pure land. It will be too comfortable. Jack's eyes were cold. Franklin said, "In my opinion, the Dark Knight Empire is just a group of bugs hiding in the dark. I'm afraid it will be very difficult for them to confront Great Xia head-on. After the battle in Hawaii, Great Xia has already beaten them until they are afraid. How would we know if we don't try? It's better than doing nothing." However, Jack was confident in the Dark Knight Empire. He believed that Keisuke Honda and the others would not easily forget the destruction of their empire. One day, they would deal a fatal blow to Great Xia. Let's give it a try then. Franklin didn't insist and changed the topic. How should we deal with the Colombian side? Should we send reinforcements? According to the intelligence from the front lines, this time, Great Xia has sent a total of 750,000 soldiers. They are determined to win. In other words, Franklin was not in favor of sending more troops. To confront the Great Xia army, the Dawson dynasty would need to send at least 500,000 soldiers, which was impossible. Jack didn't want to give up so easily. The strategic position of the Panama Canal was too important. Can we withdraw the troops that attacked the Indian Empire and ask the Brasilia dynasty to send reinforcements? We can withdraw our army, but it will be very difficult to ask the Brasilia dynasty to send reinforcements. Without the lips, the teeth will be cold. Once Great Xia conquers the Colombian region, their next target will be the Brasilia dynasty. Otherwise, why would Great Xia station so many troops in South America? Jack saw things more clearly than Franklin. As long as we tell them the pros and cons, we don't have to worry about them not sending reinforcements. Franklin nodded and agreed with Jack's judgment. Then, he analyzed the difficulties in carrying out the plan. The South American battlefield is very complicated. I'm afraid it will be very difficult for the army to withdraw from the front lines. Then let the army of the Brasilia dynasty be responsible for the rear. We are fighting for them. In that case, the resentment of the Brasilia dynasty will not be small. After all, they still hope to use this war to defeat the Indian Empire in one fell swoop. Franklin was very meticulous. The Brasilia dynasty wasn't anyone's puppet. They were willing to form an alliance with the Dawson dynasty because they wanted to fight against the Indian Empire. Therefore, this time, they sent 400,000 troops to fight on the Eastern Front. It must be known that the entire army of the Brasilia dynasty was only about 800,000 troops. This was equivalent to investing nearly half of the dynasty's army in this war. This was a great courage and determination. If they withdrew at this time, all their efforts would be in vain. Thinking about it further, without the threat of the Eastern Front, it was only a matter of time before the Indian Empire settled the Argentine region. When that time came, how could the Brasilia dynasty fight against the Indian Empire? With Great Xia's strong intervention in the South American battlefield, in the eyes of the Brasilia dynasty, could the Dawson dynasty still be a reliable backer? At that time, everything would change. Under such circumstances, it was a bit too much for Jack to ask the Brasilia dynasty to not only withdraw from the Indian Empire, but also to send reinforcements to Colombia. If they really did this, the alliance between the two sides would probably come to an end. Jack was very decisive. Let's get through the current difficulties first. As for the future, that's a matter for the future. In Jack's eyes, the so-called allies were just chess pieces. When it was time to give up, there couldn't be the slightest hesitation. Franklin sighed in his heart. According to his judgment, the kingdom would rather maintain a good relationship with the Brasilia dynasty than protect the Panama Canal. Giving up the Brasilia dynasty was a very stupid choice. After all, it was only the early stage of the Industrial Revolution. The importance of the Panama Canal to the Dawson dynasty was far less than it was in the future. Of course, Jack had his own insistence. He was focused on the future of the kingdom, so he couldn't be wrong. There's one more thing. Franklin felt that he needed to remind Jack. If we withdraw our troops from the Eastern Front, the Argentine region may not be preserved. How can we explain this to the Spanish dynasty? This time, Jack was finally stunned. Chapter 1303. The Colombian War, initiated by Great Xia, seemed to be a simple local war, but it affected the entire global battlefield. When Jack realized this, he couldn't help but have a headache. Let me think about it. Jack could decisively abandon the Brasilia dynasty, but it didn't mean that he could break his promise to the Spanish dynasty. Not to mention, if the Dawson dynasty withdrew at this time and fell into danger in the Argentine region, it would affect the European battlefield thousands of miles away and then affect the overall strategic layout of the Silver Hand. Just breaking their promise to Spain might cause the Dawson dynasty to be ostracized in Europe. The price was too high. I think we may have been fooled. We shouldn't have attacked each other so early and let the evil wolf of Great Xia take advantage of us. Jack was a little regretful. That's not something we can stop. Franklin was very calm. The Silver Hand and the Azure Emblem went from an alliance to a confrontation. In essence, it was driven by interests, and it was an irresistible trend. No one person or any dynasty could stop it. An alliance because of interests would inevitably lead to confrontation because of interests. Great Xia has played a big game of chess. Jack was a little emotional. At this point in the global war, no one could stop it if they wanted to. All the dynasties were already in the game and could no longer escape. No matter what, we still have to give it a try. Jack was ready to make a last-ditch effort. Inform the Spanish side that if it's really necessary and they give up the Argentine region, we will give them a batch of firearms for free as compensation. Compared to Great Xia, although the Dawson dynasty didn't have an advantage in population, their level of industrialization was not inferior to Great Xia at all. They also had the ability to produce a large number of firearms and compete with Great Xia. Jack was prepared to bleed in exchange for the forgiveness of the Spanish dynasty. In this case, it shouldn't be a big problem. Seeing this, Franklin no longer tried to persuade him and went to make the arrangements. That night, the Dawson dynasty sent 100,000 troops to Panama City to strengthen the city's defenses, preparing to delay the Great Xia army before the reinforcements arrived. At this time, the three armies of Great Xia had just set off and crossed the border. The Colombian War had just begun. May 18th, the Brasilia dynasty. Although the Brasilia dynasty had a vast territory, most of the areas were in tropical areas unsuitable for human habitation. The population was concentrated in the narrow southern territory and coastal areas. The rain in the tropical rainforest was abundant, and the leaching effect of the rainwater was strong. It was difficult for the nutrients absorbed by the soil to be preserved in large quantities, and the nutrients in the soil were quickly absorbed into the bodies of the plants. Therefore, the soil in the tropical rainforest was very barren. In addition, there was no distinction between dry and wet seasons, rampant diseases, muddy riverbanks, and other factors, making the tropical rainforest unsuitable for the development of agriculture. The northern part of the Brasilia Empire, including the famous Amazon rainforest, was inaccessible. In the game world, the boundless Amazon rainforest had become the natural defense barrier of the Brasilia Empire's northern territory. Until now, no troop had been able to pass through the entire rainforest. Even when the Dawson dynasty's army of 200,000 was attacking the Indian Empire, it had to first travel by sea. After arriving at St. Paul, they would join up with the army of the Brasilia dynasty and attack the Indian Empire. This was also one of the reasons why Han Xin sent all three armies to the Colombian battlefield when he was arranging the troops. Trying to attack the Brasilia dynasty from the south of Colombia was simply asking for trouble. Brasilia, Royal Palace. King Leo of Brasilia, upon reading the letter sent from the Dawson dynasty, was so angry that his entire body was trembling. Shameless bastard. He betrayed the alliance and dared to make such an unreasonable request. In the letter, Jack asked the Brasilia dynasty to cover the withdrawal of the Dawson dynasty's army from the battlefield, and at the same time, to send no less than 300,000 troops to reinforce the Colombian region. Leo had also learned of the Great Xia's attack on the Colombian region. If the Dawson dynasty only wanted to withdraw their troops from the Indian Empire, Leo could understand, but he didn't expect that Jack would be so insatiable. Do you really think we are puppets? Leo was very angry. Your Majesty, although I am angry, I feel that what the Dawson dynasty said makes sense. Once the Colombian region is captured by the Great Xia, we might be next, the Prime Minister reminded. What are you afraid of? The northern part of the kingdom is full of rainforests. Do you think the Great Xia army can fly over? Leo was very confident. Even if they take over Colombia and control the Panama Canal, the Great Xia Pacific Fleet won't be able to pass through the canal and reach the southern part of the kingdom. Besides, we don't necessarily have to fight them on the battlefield. Seeing this, the Prime Minister asked cautiously, Then, Your Majesty, should we withdraw? Leo shook his head. No, even without them, we can still fight this tough battle. The eastern front of the Indian Empire is almost impossible to defend. This is a heaven-sent opportunity, and we can't miss it. Leo understood very well that if they missed this opportunity, the Brasilia dynasty might never have a chance to rise again. Rather than sending troops to reinforce Colombia, it would be better to reinforce the front lines and destroy the eastern front of the Indian Empire in one fell swoop. It wasn't impossible to capture the capital of the Indian Empire, Cusco. As long as they won this battle, the Brasilia dynasty would be on an equal footing with the Indian Empire, and neither would be able to annex the other. Your Majesty, if we do this, aren't we afraid of the Dawson dynasty's retaliation? The Prime Minister was somewhat worried. When Leo heard this, the corners of his mouth curled up into a slightly mocking smile. Didn't you see? In order to defend the Colombian region, the Dawson dynasty has already fallen to the point where they need our reinforcements. This shows how powerful they are. In the face of this attack by the Great Xia, they can't even protect themselves. How can they retaliate against us? The Prime Minister was still worried. But there will always be an end to the war. Once the Dawson dynasty recovers, we will really be alone and helpless. Leo smiled. Who said we are helpless? I finally understand. In the whole world, neither the silver hand nor the azure emblem is a match for the Great Xia. The Great Xia is the true backer. Your Majesty, what do you mean? The Prime Minister was bewildered. Leo stood up, stared at the map of South America on the wall, and said in a low voice, The Great Xia has forcefully invaded South America, and the entire South America will usher in a new round of reshuffling. At a time like this, we can't be muddle-headed. In the past, the Great Xia had given people the impression that it had always been successful on the overseas battlefield. This time, the Great Xia had suddenly invested a total of 750,000 troops in South America, instantly changing the power structure of South America. Leo was very clear about this. When the Prime Minister saw this, he felt a faint chill in his heart. He seemed to understand His Majesty's plan. Before leaving, he carefully asked, Then, how should we reply to the Dawson dynasty? Chapter 1304. Now that the attitude of Grand Xia is unclear, we can't act rashly. Leo was very wise. How about this? Let the frontline command think of a way to delay the withdrawal as much as possible on the pretext that the frontline is tense. Understood. The Prime Minister nodded. In addition, we will send out a secret envoy group to contact Great Xia to express our goodwill. Your Majesty, don't worry. I will definitely do it well. In the blink of an eye, a week had passed. In a week, the North African army of Grand Xia had reached Panama City, and the brave Tiger Army, led by Li Xiuqing, had captured Bogota City. In view of the Dawson dynasty's additional 100,000 troops, Han Xin temporarily dispatched the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd armies of the brave Tiger Army to immediately advance west and attack Panama City together with the North African Army. The South African Army on the left was still on the march. May 24th, Liberty City, Dawson Dynasty. This week, Jack had a torturous time. First, when Casillas received the news that the Dawson Dynasty was preparing to withdraw, he flew into a rage and almost pointed at Jack's nose and cursed. I trusted you so much, but you played me. Casillas was very angry. The Argentine region was an important part of supporting the Spanish dynasty's global status. At the thought that the Argentine region might be lost, Casillas felt as if a large piece of flesh had been cut off. Jack tried his best to persuade Casillas and didn't hesitate to promise all kinds of benefits before he was able to slightly appease Casillas. He also comforted Casillas not to lose the big picture for the small. Conquering the Germanic dynasty is the right thing to do, Jack said. As the Egyptian army was blocked in the south of Spain, the Germanic dynasty was once again in trouble. The situation did not improve, and they had to recruit troops on a large scale. What was even more difficult was that with the blockade of the Mediterranean Sea route, some of the materials that the Germanic dynasty urgently needed to import, such as iron, ore, immediately became scarce, tormenting Manstein. The European battlefield was covered with dark clouds. For this reason, the Azure Badge also constantly urged Grandia to do a good job in the logistics of the Egyptian army and fulfill the agreement. How could they know that the Atlantic Fleet was still active in the Mediterranean Sea, but there were only two formations? With such little capital, how could Ouyang Shua dare to face the three allied fleets head-on? It was just a promise, and a turning point would soon appear. In addition to Casillas' anger, Leo's disobedience made Jack more passive. For the next few days, Jack urged Leo to hurry up and help Dawson's army retreat from the front lines. But Leo would always say that the situation at the front lines was too urgent and that he wouldn't be able to leave in time. Every time, Leo would reply, tomorrow we will definitely retreat." However, one day after another passed, and the battle at the eastern front of the Indian Empire was still intense. Jack even received intelligence that Leo was mobilizing troops in the country. There were signs that the troops were not used to reinforce the Colombian region, but to be sent to the front. The two of them had completely different thoughts. Realizing the seriousness of the problem, Jack had no choice but to do Leo's work, either by threatening or enticing him. Unfortunately, Leo didn't fall for it at all. This was a blow to Jack. Only now did he realize that the global deterrent power of the Dawson dynasty was not as strong as he had imagined. Given this, Jack had no choice but to order the Dawson dynasty's army to retreat from the front lines as quickly as possible, even if they had to pay a small price. The war in Colombia was in a precarious situation. As for the debt with the Brasilia dynasty, it could only be settled in the future. May 25th, Jingshi, the special envoy of the Brasilia dynasty, finally got in touch with the Chamberlain of Dependencies of Great Xia after several trips and expressed the goodwill of the Brasilia dynasty to Great Xia. His words implied that he was looking for another backer. For this matter, Ouyang Shua specially summoned Jiang Shang, Zhang Liang, and Du Ruhui, 3 ministers, for a discussion. "Your Majesty, I suggest that we ignore the Brasilia dynasty and follow the plan. After conquering Colombia, we will immediately march into the Brasilia dynasty." Du Ruhui's attitude was clear. At the same time, she was full of confidence in the American theater of operations under the command of Han Xian. For the sake of this war, Great Xia had made many arrangements. They could not easily change their target just because of a friendly gesture from the Brasilia dynasty. I think we can talk about it. If we can accept it peacefully, there is no need to use force. Jiang Shang was more inclined to accept the goodwill of the Brasilia dynasty. It was not that Jiang Shang was afraid of trouble, but there was another reason. The overseas territories, especially those with a large number of mutants, are much more difficult to govern than the domestic territories. Using barbarians to control barbarians is the basic national policy of the empire. In the long run, subduing Leo is far better than using force to conquer the Brasilia dynasty. Ouyang Shua nodded in agreement. With the cancellation of the trial grounds, Great Xia would inevitably encounter the problem of governance by the mutants. Southern border was fine as it was in the same cultural circle as China, so the mutants were less resistant. Africa was barren and relatively easy to govern. However, South America, especially the Brasilia dynasty, was the polar opposite of China's civilization. If they wanted to forcefully promote the Han culture there, it would cause a backlash. The best way was to use barbarians to control barbarians. Ouyang Shuo was also worried that if they forcefully conquered the Brasilia dynasty, they might drive the mutants from Brasilia to the Dark Knight Empire. Wouldn't that be benefiting others at their expense? After thinking about it, Ouyang Shuo said, "Then we will talk to them. There are only two conditions. First, the Brasilia dynasty must unconditionally submit to Great Xia. This is the main premise. Great Xia did not need any vassal states at the moment. Of course, although they are submitting, the imperial court will still give them a certain degree of autonomy. We will also treat all local talents equally and even give them priority." Ouyang Shuo stated his principles once again. Second, let Liu intercept the army that the Dawson dynasty left in Brasilia as a sign of allegiance. Without this, there is no need to discuss anything else. Your Majesty is wise. The eyes of Jiang Shang and the other two officials lit up. This was a brilliant plan. They could test the sincerity of the Brasilia dynasty. If Liu succeeded, he would become a mortal enemy of the Dawson dynasty. Only by relying on the protection of Great Xia would he be able to survive. If Liu didn't do it and wanted to bet on both sides, there was nothing much to say. The army would act according to the previous plan and conquer the entire Brasilia dynasty. Liu was the only one who could govern the Brasilia dynasty. Brasilia City. The next day, Liu received a reply from the Chamberlain of Dependencies. After reading it, Liu fell into a long silence. He didn't expect Great Xia to be so ruthless. Should I do it or not? Chapter 1305. There are only two paths in front of Liu. The first was to agree to the Grand Xia's terms, while the second was to agree to the Dawson dynasty's terms. The former would lose their sovereignty, but it could be settled once and for all. The latter could temporarily retain their sovereignty, but their future was uncertain. Furthermore, the consequences of rejecting Great Xia were very serious. Prime Minister, I want to hear your opinion. Although the Prime Minister was sometimes very worrisome, Liu still wanted to find someone to discuss things with during critical moments. Otherwise, he would feel uncertain. Your Imperial Majesty, we've delayed for a week without retreating. The Dawson dynasty isn't blind. There's no way they wouldn't have noticed us. Perhaps, in truth, we have already offended the Dawson dynasty. Do you mean to side with Great Xia? Liu asked. His Majesty will have to make the decision. The Prime Minister did not act on his own. As the only Homo sapiens in the Brasilia dynasty, he reminded, Your Majesty, have you thought about what kind of structure Planet Hope will have in the future? Liu frowned. He hadn't thought about this before. What do you have in mind? Asked Liu. The Prime Minister said, in the era of the Earth Federation, the world was integrated and the concept of nations faded. In the game world, not only were there new divisions of nations, but there were also heroes fighting for hegemony within a nation. It gives people the feeling that they're going to bring chaos under control and then turn back the clock of history. In fact, the Mother Goddess only did this to train and select outstanding feudal lords in the game world. She didn't want the humans to return to internal strife. That would go against the original intent of the game design. Hope Planet is an unknown place. From the information that has been revealed so far, it is a dangerous place. If humans are always busy with internal strife, how will they gain a foothold on Hope Planet? This is also the reason why the Mother Goddess returned the game map to 0. Their goal is probably to select the best of the best, to reunite the divided dynasties and form a joint force. Hearing this, Liu was shocked. If I may be so bold as to predict, there won't be more than 4 dynasties that will be able to build bases on Hope Planet in the future. Liu was surprised. Is the Prime Minister that confident? Resources. Your Majesty, do you think that the resources brought by the interstellar fleet are enough to support the territory to flourish all over Hope Planet? Liu shook his head. Even if all of them entered the game cabin, the resources consumed by the immigration team of nearly 1 billion people would still be very shocking. By the time they arrived at Hope Planet, the resources that could be given to the feudal lord would be very limited. Under such circumstances, it it was naturally impossible for the flowers to bloom everywhere. The Prime Minister's estimation was still an optimistic one. Conservatively, there might only be 2 or 3 feudal lords who would be selected as the first batch to descend on Planet Hope. The competition was fierce. This was also one of the reasons why Gaia pushed for the global war. What I mean is, if the kingdom can't get into the top 4, then don't think about anything else. Let's get a seeded player as soon as possible and give up on the so-called national concept. That's the best choice, the Prime Minister said. I understand. Leo's thoughts suddenly became clear, and he was no longer conflicted. I agree to Great Xia's conditions. As for the specific details of the cooperation, the Prime Minister will come forward to negotiate. Yes. The Prime Minister bowed and left. The capital. After receiving the reply from the Brasilia dynasty, Oyangsha summoned Jiang Shang and Du Ruhui and had the 2 ministers prepare for the preliminary negotiations and draw up a detailed takeover plan. The cabinet was responsible for the takeover of the territory and the establishment of the yamen, while the Privy Council was responsible for the takeover of the army. During the negotiations, under the premise of maintaining the prestige of the empire, you can make appropriate concessions to facilitate this matter as soon as possible. Just one thing, keep it confidential, Ouyang Shuan instructed. This humble subject understands. Du Ruhui and Jiang Shang looked at each other. They knew that His Majesty was going to use this opportunity to make a fuss. Jiang Shang asked, Your Majesty, what kind of position should we assign to Leo? This was a very crucial part of the negotiations. Up until now, the power of the Governor-General was still tightly grasped in Ouyang Shua's hands. The cabinet only had the power to recommend people, and Ouyang Shua had the final say on what to do. It was also through this point that Ouyang Shua was able to continuously infiltrate the provinces and make these feudal officials realize that no matter when, there was only one person who could decide on their promotion and dismissal. Ouyang Shua pondered for a moment and said, When the Brasilia dynasty submits and the Columbia region is included, there will be enough conditions to establish the American Protectorate. Leo, arrange for him to be the Chief of Staff of the American Protectorate. Of course, there's no problem with him becoming a provincial governor as well. As for which one to choose, let Leo choose. The Chief of Staff of the American Protectorate and the provincial governor. One was in charge of the overall situation, while the other was in charge of a region. Although they focused on different things, they were of the same level. It all depended on Leo's choice. This humble subject understands. Jiang Shang felt confident. Ouyang Shua looked at Du Ruhui. The Bureau of Military Affairs will first come up with a plan as to how to deal with the Brasilia dynasty's army. We'll discuss it in detail after we submit. Yes. May 28th. The Brasilia dynasty. Leo was a very decisive person. After sensing the Grand Xia's sincerity, although the 2 sides had yet to sign an official agreement, Leo was already prepared to fulfill his end of the bargain. The most important thing was to keep the 200,000 soldiers of the Dawson dynasty here. To Leo, carrying out this task was extremely simple because the Dawson dynasty's army didn't have any defenses against them at all. That morning, Leo sent 300,000 soldiers to the border to meet up with the Dawson dynasty's army under the pretext of receiving their allies. After the Dawson dynasty's army set up camp and lowered their defenses, the army of the Brasilia dynasty, which had set up camp nearby, suddenly launched a brazen attack against their allies, catching them off guard. At the same time, the 200,000 soldiers of the Brasilia dynasty, who were still at the front lines, suddenly turned around and launched a pincer attack against the Dawson dynasty's army. Caught off guard, the Dawson dynasty's army immediately suffered heavy losses. They were completely unable to mount an effective counterattack. Many of the soldiers didn't even understand what was going on before they were brutally slaughtered. What happened next was very simple. The Dawson dynasty's army, caught off guard, fought back with all their might, but in the end they were outnumbered. After suffering heavy losses, they had no choice but to scatter and flee. But in the Brasilia dynasty's territory, they weren't familiar with the terrain, and they didn't have any logistical support. It was very hard for the remaining soldiers of the Dawson dynasty to hold on. In the following week, they were surrounded and attacked by the Brasilia dynasty's army in every direction. Since he had fallen out with the Dawson dynasty, Leo had to do everything he could to weaken the Dawson dynasty's power. He sent orders to the front lines to annihilate the enemy, regardless of losses. After all, after submitting to the Grand Siya, the fate of these armies was still unknown. Chapter 1306. Leo's ultimate move made Jack suffer. Jack was so angry that he flipped the table on the spot when he learned that the Brasilia dynasty had betrayed him. "If I don't take revenge for this, I'm not human." Jack, who had always been gentle, finally became ferocious. His eyes were red, and he wanted to devour someone. But after the anger, Jack had to face reality. He knew that the 200,000 troops couldn't come back, which was tantamount to cutting off a piece of flesh from his body. What was worse was that without reinforcements, Columbia State couldn't be defended. After 10 days of fierce fighting, Panama City was on the verge of collapse under the continuous fierce attacks of the Great Siya Army. Both sides were first-class elite troops, and both suffered heavy losses. In order to take Panama, Han Xin was ruthless. "Your Majesty, let's withdraw. There's no point in continuing the fight." Franklin suggested, "We can't lose our footing because of the Great Siya. The most important thing now is to take down the Maple Leaf Dynasty as soon as possible." Once the Maple Leaf Dynasty was taken down, the Dawson Dynasty would dominate the entire North American continent, and they would have a capital to fight against any dynasty. They could even learn from the Great Siya and become the driving force behind the global battlefield. Hearing this, Jack closed his eyes in pain and clenched his fists so hard that his nails were embedded in his palms. After a long time, Jack loosened his fists. His palms were already bleeding. Jack wanted to let himself remember the pain at this moment. He said hoarsely, "As you said, I want to be alone." Seeing this, Franklin saluted and quietly left. On June 6th, the Dawson dynasty withdrew from Panama City. 2 days later, the entire territory of Colombia was captured by the Great Siya, and it became another overseas territory of the Great Siya. The Great Siya imperial court acted very quickly. The next day, it issued an order to merge Columbia County into the Columbia region and jointly establish the Columbia province, which was the first province of the Great Siya on the American continent. The provincial administration was chosen to be in Bogota. Zhou Haichun, the former governor of Ogwa County and a trusted minister of Ouyang Shaw, was promoted to the governor of Columbia and guarded this vital place on behalf of the imperial court. The news of the Great Siya conquering Columbia set off a huge storm around the world. Although the entire world had descended into chaos, the second direct confrontation between the two giants of the Grand Siya dynasty and the Dawson dynasty was still the focus of the entire world. Last time, the Grand Siya had captured the Hawaiian Islands and defeated the Dawson dynasty's Freedom Fleet at the same time. They had won a beautiful victory, suppressing the Dawson dynasty and establishing their prestige on a global scale. The confrontation this time attracted even more attention. The results showed that the Grand Siya was like the autumn wind sweeping away the fallen leaves. They had completely destroyed the Columbia region and taken over the most important territory of the Dawson dynasty. The significance of this was even more extraordinary. From this moment onwards, Great Siya officially established its prestige in the world. The attitude of a global hegemon was gradually being revealed, bursting forth, making people revere it. On the other hand, the Dawson dynasty's prestige had suffered another blow. Given that their ally, the Brasilia dynasty, had betrayed them at the last moment, Jack had lost even more face. Even the prestige of the Silver Hand had suffered a heavy blow, which made the Azure Badge applaud. After this battle, the influence of the Dawson dynasty in South America was suppressed to the freezing point, and the Grand Siya replaced it as the new ruler of South America. But what was strange was that although the Brasilia dynasty had betrayed the Dawson dynasty, they had not announced their allegiance to the Grand Siya, which puzzled the outside world. Some people suspected that the Brasilia dynasty had used the Grand Siya's hand to play a trick on the Dawson dynasty, and now they were playing the same trick on the Grand Siya again. Only the parties involved knew what the truth was. The outside world paid attention to the end of the war in Colombia, but they didn't notice a small detail. June 10th. Not long after the Grand Sia conquered the entire territory of Colombia, the 3rd, 4th, and 5th formations of the Atlantic Fleet of the Grand Sia appeared in the ports of Caracas, Georgetown, and Paramaribo, respectively. According to the original plan, after conquering Colombia, the brave Tiger Army and the Southern American Army, under the escort of the Atlantic Fleet, would go straight to the southeast coast of the Brasilia dynasty. This was also the reason why the Atlantic Fleet had disappeared in the Mediterranean Sea. With the imminent surrender of the Brasilia dynasty, the war situation had changed, and the 3 formations of the Atlantic Fleet also had new tasks. With the assistance of the American Theater of Operations, they would conquer the Greater and Lesser Antilles around the Caribbean Sea. Their goal was to control the entire Caribbean Sea for the imperial court. The Caribbean Sea was located in the tropical Atlantic Ocean of the Western Hemisphere. It was the world's largest inland sea. The Yucatan Peninsula of Mexico and the Central American countries were in the west and southwest. The Greater Antilles were in the north, the Lesser Antilles were in the east, and South America was in the south. Because of this geographical location, some people once called it the American Mediterranean together with the Gulf of Mexico. In oceanography, it was called the Central American Sea. If the Panama Canal was the passage connecting the Pacific Ocean and the Atlantic Ocean, then the Caribbean Sea was a barrier that merchant ships couldn't bypass. To truly control the Panama Canal, they had to control the Caribbean Sea. Jack was very clear about this. After conquering Panama and other countries and establishing the state of Colombia, he immediately sent out a fleet to encircle the Caribbean pirates and conquer the Greater and Lesser Antilles. In order to eliminate the famous Caribbean pirates, the Dawson dynasty's navy had suffered a lot. The good thing was that after this battle, the entire Caribbean Sea had almost become the inland sea of the state of Colombia. Because the Mayan dynasty in the east had been established late and their navy was underdeveloped, they had no say in the Caribbean Sea at all. The Great Sia established the province of Colombia naturally to emulate the Dawson dynasty and completely wipe out the Dawson dynasty's presence there, truly becoming a turtle dove occupying the magpie's nest. Otherwise, there would be endless troubles in the future. This was also very important to raising the Great Sia's future voice in the entire American continent. It was precisely because of this that Ouyang Shua would rather delay the war in Europe and force the Atlantic Fleet into South America, opening up the last sea pass for the empire. June 12th, Brasilia Dynasty. Of course, Leo wasn't as stupid as the outside world thought. After offending the Dawson dynasty, if he still dared to make fun of the Great Sia, wouldn't that be courting death? The reason why Leo didn't submit to the Great Sia was because he still had to complete a mission given to him by Ouyang Shua. Before the formation of the Federation, Brazil was the big brother of South America, but Brazil's geographical and resource advantage was far from being as superior as it seemed. Apart from the large areas of rainforest in the north that were not suitable for farming, there was also a bottleneck in the south. Brazil's main cities and ports were concentrated in the southeast coast, which was also the most prosperous area of the country. But the tragedy was that within Brazil, there was not a single large river that led to the southeast coast. That was awkward. Without an outlet, it meant that there was no way to connect the inland with the coast, and development was naturally limited. In the industrial era, where sea power completely replaced land power, the geographical foundation often played an important role, specifically in logistics and transportation. Whoever controlled the estuary of the river would control the entire river basin. Within Brazil, the only large river with an estuary was called the Rio de la Plata, but the estuary of the river was not in Brazil, but in the hands of the Argentines. The capital of Argentina, Bino, was located here. Realizing this, Ouyang Shua naturally didn't plan to just stand by and watch. He immediately instructed Leo to stop the war on the Eastern Front, turn south, and take down Bino City before he submitted. While the storm was brewing in South America, the war between the Indian Empire and the Argentine region didn't stop for a moment. After the withdrawal of 50,000 troops, the Spanish army's decline gradually became apparent. Although Juarez purchased firearms that had been eliminated by the Great Sia, the Indian army had numerical advantage, and the two sides had reversed the situation. Following the defeat of the Dawson dynasty in South America, Casillas no longer had the confidence to protect the Argentine region. Under such circumstances, Ouyang Shual was prepared to snatch food from the tiger's mouth. This was something that couldn't be helped. If Bino City fell into the hands of the Indian Empire, the value of the Brasilia dynasty would be greatly reduced, which would then affect the layout of the Great Sia in the entire South America. Ouyang Shual believed in one thing. If he wanted the Indian Empire to have no worries, not to go against the Great Sia or fall out with them, the only way was to make them lose their capital. Taking control of Bino City was the key step. Moreover, Bino City was still in the hands of the Spanish, and it was the Brasilia dynasty that had not submitted yet. Ouyang Shual didn't directly violate the interests of the Indian Empire. At least in terms of face, it was still acceptable. As for whether Juarez would have a knot in his heart because of this, it wasn't something that Ouyang Shual considered now. Ouyang Shual had to do what he had to do. Chapter 1307. While wiping out the army of the Dawson dynasty, the Brasilia dynasty also stopped attacking the eastern front of the Indian Empire. The frontline troops turned from offense to defense, consolidating the fruits of victory. This made the Indian king, Juarez, heave a sigh of relief. Juarez was ready to attack the eastern front and recover the lost land after conquering the Argentine region. In addition, the Great Sia had conquered the Colombian region, and the troublesome Dawson dynasty was forced to retreat from the South American continent. The spring of the Indian Empire seemed to be coming soon. As it turned out, Juarez was happy a little too early. On the 15th of June, the 300,000 troops of the Brasilia dynasty suddenly moved south. The vast army conquered the entire territory of Uruguay in just 4 days. Then, the army crossed the Rio de la Plata and went straight to Bino City. Uruguay had been destroyed by the Spanish dynasty and became a part of the Argentine region. This time, it changed hands again. The other region, Paraguay, had fallen into the hands of the Indian Empire. With the Brasilia dynasty's army approaching the city, the governor of Argentina, Alexander, was really under pressure. There were pursuers in front and tigers and wolves behind. The Brasilia dynasty's army was not polite. The next day, they launched an attack on Bino City. This time, the Spanish army immediately fell into a predicament. Alexander had no choice but to request the kingdom to give up the Argentine region in order to protect the army. After a series of battles, the 200,000 Spanish soldiers were reduced to 120,000. If they continued to fight, they might be completely wiped out. After receiving the report, although Casillas didn't want to do so, all he could do was curse the Dawson dynasty while agreeing to Alexander's request to withdraw. In fact, as early as the moment the Dawson dynasty prepared to withdraw from the eastern front of the Indian Empire, the Argentine region was destined to be lost. As the Dawson dynasty lost the whole of Colombia, Casillas completely lost hope. Although it was the last resort to withdraw now, it was the only choice. Fine, let the Indian Empire and the Brasilia dynasty fight each other. I don't want to play anymore. Casillas could only comfort himself in this way. Of course, if Casillas knew that the Brasilia dynasty had secretly submitted to the Great Sia, he might not think so. On the 22nd of June, the 80,000 Spanish troops stationed in Bino City teleported away. As for the 40,000 troops left at the front, Alexander had no confidence to protect them, so he could only abandon them. In the afternoon of the same day, the army of the Brasilia dynasty seized the opportunity to capture Bino City. Following Ouyang Shual's instructions, they stopped after sweeping the counties around Bino City. The remaining territory would be given to the Indian Empire. Indian Empire, Cusco City. For the past few days, Juarez's mood had been like a roller coaster, up and down. As soon as they saw a glimmer of light, they received news that Brasilia's army was heading south. Before they could react, Uruguay had already fallen into the hands of Brasilia's army. Juarez immediately realized that the Brasilia dynasty was trying to reap the fruits of their labor. He immediately ordered his army to speed up and advance towards Bino City. Even if they were to run into the Brasilia dynasty's army, they would not hesitate to fight. But before the army was mobilized, the Spaniards had already retreated without a backbone, which gave the Brasilia army a great advantage. They took down Bino City without any effort. This made Juarez so angry that he almost vomited blood. "What's wrong? We fought for so long and paid a heavy price, but in the end, the fattest piece of meat was taken away by our enemy." Juarez felt like a cooked duck had flown away. Juarez immediately ordered his army to continue advancing into Bino City. He wanted to take back Bino City from the hands of the Brasilia dynasty. Anyway, the two dynasties were mortal enemies, so there was no need to be polite. At this time, on the 24th of June, the Brasilia dynasty officially announced that they would submit to Great Xia. F***CK. Juarez was so sullen that he was about to explode. He finally understood who was behind this. "I treated you as an ally, but you played dirty behind my back." Juarez felt like he had been played, and for the first time he felt a trace of dissatisfaction towards Great Xia. The relationship between the two parties was already not very harmonious, and now there was another crack. But even though he was angry, Juarez did not dare to act rashly. He urgently ordered the frontline troops to stop advancing towards Bino City and turn to sweep the other regions of Argentina. The Brasilia dynasty, which had the support of Great Xia, and the Brasilia dynasty, which fought alone, were two completely different concepts. Juarez was not confident enough to go to war with Great Xia. If that was the case, the Indian Empire would really be isolated. After the appearance of the Dark Knight Empire, it was not only Great Xia that was affected, but also the Indian Empire. In the land of Mother, there were also many enemies that were destroyed by Juarez. Moreover, the land of Mother was closer to South America, so it was a greater threat to the Indian Empire. During this period, if it was not for the Pacific fleet of Great Xia, the western coast of the Indian Empire would be in chaos because of the Dark Knight fleet. Because of this, Juarez did not dare to fall out with Great Xia. Just when Juarez was unable to vent his anger, someone suddenly came to report that a delegation from the Honlu Temple of Great Xia had arrived in Cusco City and requested an audience. Juarez took a deep breath and tried his best to suppress the evil fire in his heart. Then he said, "Invite the delegation to wait in the main hall. I will be there soon." Yes. In the main hall of the palace, Juarez received the delegation from Great Xia. At 4 o'clock in the afternoon, after sending off the delegation from Great Xia, Juarez had a complicated expression on his face. The delegation that Great Xia sent was to discuss South American affairs, and the conditions that they offered were impossible for Juarez to refuse. First, Great Xia's ambition for the Argentina region was limited to the land that they currently occupied. They had no improper thoughts for the remaining vast areas of Argentina. This was to dispel Juarez's concerns and show that Great Xia was not a pushover. Second, after taking over the Brasilia dynasty, Great Xia was willing to unconditionally return more than 10 cities on the Eastern Front, and at the same time, release the captives of the Indian Empire. This was a genuine show of goodwill. In the early stages, the 600,000 Allied forces attacked the Eastern Front of the Indian Empire, causing a heavy blow to the Indian Empire. This time, Great Xia took the initiative to return the cities, which was a great favor. Just these 2 points were enough to eliminate Juarez's resentment. The conditions that Great Xia offered were not only limited to this, but also included assisting the Indian Empire in rebuilding the industrial system. The Great Xia Bank was willing to provide a low-interest loan of up to 20 million gold coins for the post-war reconstruction work of the Indian Empire. This was also a real benefit. After a series of wars, the Indian Empire was riddled with holes and urgently needed to recuperate. However, this all required money. Unfortunately, the two arms orders had basically emptied the Indian Empire's treasury. The loan provided by the Great Xia Bank was truly a timely help. Of course, this was also the first time that the Great Xia Bank had launched an international financial business, and they could use this opportunity to enter the financial market of the Indian Empire. A loan of 20 million gold coins could be considered a stepping stone. Neither side suffered a loss. As for reaffirming the alliance between the two sides and strengthening trade cooperation, these were all part of the plan. After this combination, Juarez completely lost his temper. He could only obediently stand in the Great Xia's camp and wave the flag for Great Xia to establish global hegemony. At this point, the situation in the South American continent had basically stabilized. After this battle, not only did Great Xia control another key sea route and strengthen its maritime hegemony, but it also established its dominance in the South American continent. At the same time, it obtained a relatively stable overseas territory. With this as a bargaining chip, Great Xia had a certain say in the affairs of the entire Americas in the future, and they could create obstacles for the Dawson dynasty at any time. Next, it was time to properly manage this fertile territory. As for annexing the Indian Empire and unifying the South American continent, Ouyang Shua had no intention of doing so. After the world entered industrialization, it wasn't that the more territory one occupied, the more powerful one would be. The key was geographical location and resources. Their current territory was already enough to support Great Xia's global strategy. There was no need to be greedy and think about the territory of their allies. Even if they did take it, putting aside the price they would have to pay, how to manage it was a huge problem. Given Juarez's management of the Indian Empire over the years, the concept of Indian supremacy had long since permeated the entire dynasty. The common people were extremely stubborn. Just thinking about taming such a dynasty gave Ouyang Shua a headache. Thus, rather than paying a huge price to annex the Indian Empire, it was better to maintain the status quo and achieve a win-win situation. After all, as long as the South American continent was stable, Great Xia would profit. This was also the reason why Ouyang Shua was willing to make huge concessions in order to quickly eliminate Juarez's resentment. Time was money. The value of a stable South America to Great Xia was immeasurable. Chapter 1308. On the last day of June, the Imperial Court of Great Xia announced the territorial structure and personnel changes in South America. The Imperial Court decreed that the Brasilia dynasty, including the Uruguay region and the surroundings of Bino City, was divided into 3 major provinces. From north to south, they were Amazon Province, Brasilia Province, and Uruguay Province. Between the Amazon Province and the Brasilia Province, the former King City of Brasilia was the boundary. Brasilia City was included in the Amazon Province to the north, and it served as the provincial seat. Fang Xiaoru, the former governor of Fuyong Prefecture in Minnan Province, was promoted to the governor of Amazon Province. Among the 3 major provinces, Amazon Province was the largest province, but also the most difficult to govern. At the same time, it was also the province with the weakest economic strength and the smallest development potential. Of course, because Brasilia City was included in the province, its political significance was extraordinary. Even the administrative center of the American Protectorate was chosen to be in Brasilia City, indicating that the city would continue to bear the historical mission of the political center of South America. This arrangement was also to minimize the influence of the former dynasty. Ouyang Shua had high expectations for Fang Xiaoru to manage the Amazon. First and foremost, he was responsible for opening up the road between the Columbia Province and the Amazon Province. Only in this way could the entire South American territory be connected. The province of Brasilia and the province of Uruguay were separated by the city of Sao Paulo, which was included in the province of Brasilia to the north, and at the same time served as the provincial seat. Between the governor and the protectorate of Great Xia, Leo finally chose the governor. Ouyang Shua did not make any statement about this and directly gave the position of the governor of Brasilia Province to Leo. In this way, Leo was the first in Great Xia to still be able to serve in the territory after submitting. However, the area of office was reduced by more than half. The southernmost Uruguay province included the southernmost part of the Brasilia dynasty, the Uruguay region, and the surrounding counties of Bino City. The provincial seat was naturally located in Bino City. Such a division was extraordinary. It allowed Uruguay province to have the capital to compete with Brasilia province. It was also a key move by Ouyang Shua to balance Leo's influence in the Brasilia region. It was both trust and restriction. This was Ouyang Shua's usual style of doing things. The former southern Siang province's Yongzhou prefectural governor, Gu Henshao, was promoted to Uruguay province's governor. Before he submitted to Great Xia, Gu Henshao was also a feudal lord. Now that he was promoted to the governor-general position, and it was a heavyweight province like Uruguay province, Gu Henshao felt that he had leaped through the Dragon's Gate. From now on, his future was limitless. This was in line with Ouyang Shua's way of using people. He boldly used the NPCs and overlord players, giving them ample opportunities to gain experience and even allowing them to make some mistakes. Making a mistake in the game world was better than causing trouble on Hope Planet. These three provinces, together with the recently established Columbia province, formed the Protectorate of the Americas. At the same time, it was also the fifth protectorate in Great Xia and the third overseas protectorate. The former Western Frontier Protector General Bainan was transferred to the American Protector General. As such, Lao Ai became the first civil official in the history of Great Xia to serve in two protectorates. His name was destined to be recorded in the annals of Great Xia. Compared to the border of the Western Frontier, the South American continent was full of vitality and extraordinary potential. Therefore, although Lao Ai's transfer was a flat transfer, it was actually a hidden promotion, giving Lao Ai a broader stage. The former Shu province governor of Chengdu, Yi, was promoted to the chief historian of the American Protectorate. During the Northern Zhou dynasty, Zhang Yi served as the Minister of Internal Affairs and served as the chief historian of the Prime Minister's office. After Yang Jian established the Sui dynasty, he served as the provincial governor of Long Province and the provincial governor of Qi Province. Due to illness, he died in his position as the provincial governor of Qi Province. Ouyang Shua chose Zhang Yi because of his experience as the chief historian of the Prime Minister's office. He believed that with Zhang Yi's ability, he would definitely be able to assist Lao Ai in governing the huge American protectorate. The person who replaced Lao Ai as the Western Frontier Protector General was the former governor of the Central Plains, Feng Xiuwang. Compared to Lao Ai, Ouyang Shua actually had higher expectations for Feng Xiuwang. This time, he didn't directly appoint Feng Xiuwang as the American Protector General. Other than the issue of seniority, the more important reason was that Ouyang Shua had other arrangements for Feng Xiuwang. The Western Frontier Protector General was just a temporary arrangement. The position of the governor of the Central Plains that Feng Xiuwang left behind was taken up by Guanbang. Guanbang was Old Gua, one of the two powerhouses of China's elite class. This time, he finally agreed to step into the Great Xia bureaucracy. Last year, the other powerhouse, Old Zhang's son, Zhang Bangxin, was appointed as the head of the Civil Affairs Bureau of Great Xia. This was the beginning of Ouyang Shua's plan to rope in China's elite class. This time, Old Gua's appearance meant that China's elite class had basically recognized Great Xia. Of course, the symbolic meaning of Old Gua's appearance was far greater than the actual meaning. Firstly, Ouyang Shua would never transfer someone like Old Gua, who he didn't understand and trust, to the central government. Secondly, Old Gua's age was obvious, and his future potential couldn't even be compared to Jiang Shang and the other wise men. At this point, the imperial court's plan for the American Protectorate was temporarily put on hold. Other than the governor, county magistrate, and other government officials, according to the previous promise, would be led by the local people. Apart from that, the administrative yuan also transferred a batch of demoted magistrates and county magistrates to America to assist the local people in establishing a government structure that was in sync with the imperial court. At the same time, they were also responsible for spreading the Chinese civilization. All in all, Great Xia's governance of South America had just begun, and there was still a long way to go. Other than the internal affairs, the military arrangements had also been finalized. Firstly, it was the Navy. The Atlantic Fleet's 3rd, 4th, and 5th formations would be stationed in America. In the future, the American Protectorate would cooperate with the fleet to establish naval bases along the eastern coast of South America. Only then would the Atlantic Fleet be worthy of its name. In the future, Ouyang Shu even considered moving the headquarters of the Atlantic Fleet to the American continent. After the war in Europe calmed down, the Atlantic Fleet would mainly carry out escort missions in the Mediterranean Sea. If there was a need for war, they would have to establish a Mediterranean fleet. Otherwise, the Atlantic Fleet wouldn't be able to take care of the vast Atlantic Ocean and the Mediterranean Sea at the same time. The Gulf of Aden and the Red Sea had been put under the jurisdiction of the Indian Ocean Fleet. At the same time, with the cooperation of the American Theater of Operations, the Atlantic Fleet had already conquered the Lesser Antilles and was currently in the process of conquering the Greater Antilles. Given that the Greater Antilles was the gateway to the Gulf of Mexico, and the Gulf of Mexico was the lifeline of the Dawson dynasty, it wouldn't be so easy to conquer the Greater Antilles. The Dawson dynasty would definitely defend to the end. Ouyang Shu had also made preparations for a protracted war. He ordered the American Theater of Operations and the Atlantic Fleet to adopt a strategy of nibbling away at the Greater Antilles. The attack on the Greater Antilles was in itself a form of deterrence to the Dawson dynasty. After the establishment of the American Protectorate, the defense areas of the 3 armies of the American Theater of Operations became increasingly clear. The North American Army was stationed in the Columbia Province, while the South American Army was in charge of the defense of the Amazon Province, Brasilia Province, and Uruguay Province. As for the stalwart Tiger Army, it was temporarily stationed in the Brasilia Province. After all, the Brasilia dynasty had just submitted, and there were still many unstable factors in its territory. A large army was needed to stand guard and cooperate with the government to clean up this tumor. After the situation in South America had completely calmed down, the stalwart Tiger Army would act according to their mission. Finally, it was time to deal with the 550,000 Brasilia soldiers. This was also the most difficult part. Fortunately, the Privy Council had come up with a very interesting plan that Ouyang Shu approved of. Chapter 1309. The Privy Council suggested that the 550,000 soldiers in Brasilia should be reduced to 500,000. The wounded and unqualified soldiers should be eliminated, including the only son of the Great Xia Army, who were the priority targets for disarmament. Eliminating 50,000 people was already the limit. In view of the unstable situation in the Protectorate of America, if a large number of officers and soldiers were disbanded at once and sent into the civilian ranks, it would become a massive security threat that would affect the governance of the local government. At the same time, it would also give Leo and other local officials some unrealistic fantasies. Therefore, this force must be restrained within the army. Without military power, Ouyang Shu wasn't afraid of Leo and the others stirring up a storm. After a long time, they would give up on such thoughts and take the initiative to integrate into the system of Great Xia. Then, they would pick out the most elite soldiers to replenish the losses of the American Theater of Operations. In order to capture Panama City, both the North American Army and the brave Tiger Army suffered certain losses, especially the North American Army, which was the main force of the attack. It suffered a lot of casualties and was in urgent need of reinforcements. Absorbing a portion of the Brasilia soldiers into the army was also conducive to uniting the local people and improving the relationship between the military and the people. This way, the South American people wouldn't feel that the Great Xia Army was used to monitor them. In addition, the South American Army, as the garrison force, would also reserve some soldier quotas to recruit South American mutants who were interested in joining the army and attract the elites among them. This was another method to divide and rope in the local mutants. According to the calculations of the Bureau of Military Affairs, after making up for the losses, there would still be around 450,000 men left. It was recommended that they be reorganized into 2 large armies, one of which was not full. The two armies were not part of the Great Xia dynasty's regular army. Their mission was not on the front lines of the empire, but on the global battlefield. They mainly participated in wars that the empire could not participate in openly. They could be called the empire's mercenaries. For this, the Bureau of Military Affairs also gave specific suggestions. At this stage, he could send the first mercenary group to the battlefield of the Maple Leaf Dynasty and the second mercenary group to the battlefield of the Mayan Dynasty. This pincer attack would continue to tie down the Dawson Dynasty and prevent its rise to power. While suppressing the Dawson Dynasty, the American War Zone and the Atlantic Fleet would be able to seize the opportunity to seize the Greater Antilles Islands while the Dawson Dynasty was in a state of civil strife. This was killing two birds with one stone. Given the situation of the Maple Leaf Dynasty and the Mayan Dynasty, as long as Great Xia gave them a hint, they would immediately take the initiative to accept this power. There were only two core hiring rules. Firstly, the mercenary dynasty had to be responsible for the logistics of the mercenary army. This was the proper meaning of the question. It had to be emphasized that the mercenary salaries were still paid by the empire. This was also an important part of the empire's control over the mercenaries. For this reason, the soldiers' pay would not be given to the officers and soldiers, but to their designated family members. Family was another part of the empire's plan to restrain the mercenaries, ensuring that the mercenaries would not have other thoughts. Of course, if the mercenaries died in battle, the empire would also give them compensation. They weren't treated as outsiders. The empire would also reward the soldiers for their meritorious service on the battlefield, but only in secret. The source of the army's pay was the high employment fees paid by the empire. In order to motivate the mercenaries to fight bravely on the front lines, the Privy Council suggested that the mercenaries' salary standards could be increased by 50% on the basis of the empire's field army. Great Xia's military pay was already generous, and an increase of 50% was enough to make people tempted. Secondly, the mercenary dynasty had to allocate a piece of land for Great Xia to build an exclusive military base for the mercenary army. A military base was not only a fixed garrison for the mercenaries, but it was also a key way for Great Xia to exercise sovereignty and jurisdiction over the mercenaries. The rights enjoyed by the military base were equivalent to those enjoyed by Great Xia's overseas territories. At the same time, in order to strengthen the management of the military base, the Privy Council would participate in the construction of the military base and the establishment of the base command center to ensure that it was under control. This was impressive. Even after the war ended, Great Xia could still continue to exert influence on the empire through the military base. It was no wonder that Ouyang Shuo readily agreed to the Privy Council's reorganization plan. With these 2 points, coupled with the fact that during the reorganization of the mercenaries, the Privy Council would replace a batch of soldiers from the American theater of operations into the mercenaries. This basically guaranteed that this army would still be in the hands of the empire. In this way, not only would the hidden danger of the South American region be eliminated, but it would also give the empire a good hand. After the Privy Council's plan was approved, they began to act in full swing. The negotiation with the Maple Leaf Dynasty and the Mayan Dynasty was led by the Honlu Temple, and the person who was appointed as the empire's special envoy was Di Chun. Ouyang Shuo recognized Di Chun's ability and was willing to give him a platform to display his abilities. As Ouyang Shuo had expected, after Great Xia revealed that they were willing to provide mercenaries, both the Maple Leaf Dynasty and the Mayan Dynasty were overjoyed. Especially the Maple Leaf Dynasty. It was as if they had seen their savior. After the Dawson Dynasty retreated from Colombia, Jack ordered to strengthen the attack on the Maple Leaf Dynasty, whether it was for the sake of the dynasty's strategy or to vent his anger. Jack even said that he would conquer the Maple Leaf Dynasty within a month and unify North America. The army at the front line seemed to have felt the king's anger. It was as if they were on steroids, and they advanced toward the core of the Maple Leaf Dynasty with high morale. Even with the support of the firearms provided by Great Xia, the Maple Leaf Dynasty was on the verge of collapse. At this time, Any outside help was extremely precious to the Maple Leaf Dynasty. They didn't resist the conditions proposed by Great Xia and accepted them completely. To be honest, the conditions proposed by Great Xia weren't excessive at all for the two dynasties. Compared to the survival of the dynasty, a military base and a sum of money meant nothing. These mercenaries were fighting for them. Ouyang Shua was also very humane. Apart from paying with gold coins, they could also use rare ores and other resources or the mining rights. All in all, they wouldn't force the two dynasties into a desperate situation. Through the settlement of funds, the Great Xia Commercial Bank also took this opportunity to enter the financial market of the two dynasties, taking a solid step towards becoming a global commercial bank. As the tide of industrialization surged, iron, copper, aluminum, cadmium, nickel, and other mineral resources, as well as energy resources such as oil and natural gas, had risen to the strategic level of the empire. Due to this, with Ouyang Shua's approval, the imperial court had established the Land and Resources Agency a few days ago to take responsibility for the protection and rational use of natural resources such as land, mineral, energy, and ocean resources. With the tide of industrialization, the structure of the empire also ushered in a new round of breakthroughs. In order to meet the development needs of the empire, one institution after another was established. The functions of the empire were more and more in line with those of a modernized country. Under the Land and Resources Agency were the state headmaster, the Department of Ocean, the Department of Geological Survey, the Department of Mineral Resources, and the Department of Energy. They had a clear division of labor to support the empire's industrialization strategy. Among the 5 departments, the Department of Geological Survey had the easiest work. They didn't have to be like their ancestors, who had to climb mountains and sleep in the open just to find a mine or an oil field. All they had to do was follow the distribution of resources in the real world. Just in China itself, there were all sorts of mineral and oil resources, which was enough to support the empire's industrialization process. Of course, Ouyang Shua wasn't a short-sighted person. He instructed the Land and Resources Agency to focus on protective and orderly mining of local resources and increase the mining of overseas territories such as Africa, South Africa, and South America. If necessary, they could even consider importing from other dynasties. All in all, they couldn't kill the goose that laid the golden eggs. They had to walk the path of sustainable development. After all, in Ouyang Shua's strategic plan, the position of the gaming world would be important for a long time in the future. Apart from establishing the Land and Resources Agency, under Ouyang Shua's personal supervision, the empire also established the China Mining Corporation and China Energy Corporation to take on the responsibility of mining and energy exploitation. As soon as the two corporations were established, they were destined to be giants. Throughout the empire, with the mines and oil fields as the center, modern factories rose from the ground and set up a complete set of supporting facilities to process the resources and then transport them to the coastal cities. Connecting the mainland and the coastal cities was the railway network that was under construction. The focus of the empire's construction gradually shifted from agriculture to industry. The imperial court and various government offices also used preferential policies to encourage farmers and handicraftsmen to become workers and participate in the wave of industrialization. More talented people with unrecognized talent would also have the opportunity to display their talents. The entire empire was full of vitality. Everywhere was bustling with construction, which was a stark contrast to the wars of the other dynasties. The Grand Xia's population was bursting with unprecedented energy, and this was the foundation for the Grand Xia to dominate the world. Compared to the Grand Xia, although the Dawson dynasty could be said to be peaceful, the population of the Dawson dynasty didn't even reach 100 million. There was no way it could be compared to the Grand Xia. Vast territory, rich resources, abundant population, stable environment, and highly effective internal administration system. All these factors were stacked together, and a new empire was bound to be built. In the process of industrialization, the Grand Xia had gradually left the other dynasties behind. It was walking at the forefront of the world, and it was moving faster and faster. Such a Grand Xia was even more terrifying than the Grand Xia that only knew how to fight on the battlefield. If the global war continued like this, the Grand Xia would definitely be the final winner. There was no reason for Ouyang Shua to let go of the right time, the right place, and the right people. July 1st, the capital. The perfect conclusion of the war in South America had relieved one of Ouyang Shua's worries. Next, the focus of the Imperial Army would shift from South America to the battlefield in Europe. In order to coordinate with the Empire's strategy, it was necessary to disrupt the situation in Europe. The most important thing was to ensure that the Germanic Empire wouldn't be destroyed. For this reason, Ouyang Shua instructed by Qi, "You can start now." Chapter 13:10. After 3.5 months of fierce fighting, the European continent was filled with a solemn and sad atmosphere. As the main battlefield, the Germanic dynasty was even more devastated. The tenacity of the Germanic dynasty exceeded the expectations of the Allies. In this battle of life and death, in just 3 months, the Germanic dynasty recruited more than 400,000 soldiers. The total strength of the dynasty did not decrease, but increased. As time passed, the logistical pressure brought by the Allies' expedition became increasingly apparent. The European battlefield fell into a stalemate for a while. At this time, the Allies were eager to get help from the Dawson dynasty in order to conquer the Germanic dynasty at the lowest cost in one go. Otherwise, as time passed, even if the Allies won, it would be a lose-lose situation. The entire European continent, which had been painstakingly accumulated, would all be trapped in this war. Unfortunately, the Dawson dynasty had just suffered a big setback in South America. Not only did they lose the Columbia region, but they were also attacked by Great Xia at their doorstep in the Gulf of Mexico. At this time, Jack was full of energy and wanted to make contributions on the North American battlefield. How could he have the strength to help the European allies far away in the Atlantic Ocean? This was embarrassing. The only thing that comforted the allies was that Great Xia, a potential threat, did not seem to have any real intention to intervene in the European battlefield. Even the North African army was advancing very slowly in the Algerian region. Although puzzled, the allies were still very happy. It was under such circumstances that the dormant Great Xia suddenly revealed its fangs. On July 2nd, the North African army of Great Xia, which had already penetrated deep into the Algerian territory, suddenly changed its conservative style and suddenly became active, launching a fierce attack on the Spanish army stationed in the area. Caught off guard, the Spanish army was forced to retreat. Not only did the North African army have the advantage in numbers, but their individual combat power was also stronger than the enemy. With this attack, it was like breaking dry weeds and smashing rotten wood. In less than a week, they swept through half of the Algerian region. On July 10th, the North African army advanced to the city of Algiers. Although the advance was rapid, the North African army was troubled by the lack of food. During this period of confrontation, the Protectorate of Africa collected a large number of food supplies from the Libyan province and Egyptian province and continuously transported them to the front line and hoarded them in the border cities. The North African army worked hard at the front line, and the food transport team quickly followed with tacit cooperation. Such an efficient logistics organization was mainly due to Great Xia's complete takeover of the Egyptian dynasty. It had been almost 3 months since Great Xia took over the Egyptian dynasty. With the combined efforts of the Protectorate of Africa and the Provincial Governor's Office, the provinces of Egypt and Libya were gradually on the right track. Whether the local people were willing or not, they had already tacitly accepted the fact that they had to change their nationality. Coupled with the deterrence of the army and the kindness of the Yamen, most of the people had already adjusted their mentality and were ready to start a new life. They did not want to go through too much trouble. Local order was restored. If he really couldn't get over it, the bullies imprisoned in the prisons of the various government offices were the best warning. The Protector General of Africa, Moulin Lanyue, was used to using a combination of strength and gentleness to govern Africa. Usually, this illustrious female protector general could chat with ordinary people on the streets like the girl next door. But when she really encountered a troublesome matter, when she needed to be decisive, Mulan Yue did not even frown. Ever since she first governed the Morocco province, Mulan Yu's name had quietly spread throughout the African continent. After she became the African Protector General, her reputation reached a new peak. The African people regarded her as the reincarnation of Hua Mulan of Huaxia and were filled with reverence. This was not without reason. From April to July, more than 100 large and small protests broke out in the three major provinces. Some were just street demonstrations, while others turned into mass violence. Mulan Lanyue gave instructions to persuade those who protested to leave. But for violent incidents, the Yamen would not tolerate them. They decisively sent out bailiffs to suppress them. If there were not enough bailiffs, then the provincial guards would be mobilized. During the most violent incident, Mulan Lanyue did not hesitate to contact the African war zone and send out the regular army to suppress them. Only then did the evil wind gradually stop. The hot-headed Egyptian people also gradually came to their senses. They knew that going against the imperial court would not end well. It might even affect their families. The gains did not make up for the losses. On the contrary, if they acknowledged the imperial court's rule, they would quickly discover that compared to before, the internal affairs of Great Xia were much more efficient, honest, and just. In addition, the public service projects such as schools, hospitals, and roads were built with the assistance of the imperial court, which greatly improved the lives of the local people. Coupled with the influx of a large number of merchants, their future lives would only get better. Comparing the two, it was very clear which choice to make. After 3 months, the internal threats in the Egyptian provinces were initially controlled. Coupled with the subsiding of the war in South America, Ouyang Shua decided to start a war in Africa. The commander-in-chief of the African war zone, Bai Qi, understood Ouyang Shua's meaning very well. With the strong backing of the protectorate, the African war zone would have the confidence to launch a fierce attack on the target. They would not have to worry about a sudden fire in their backyard. Just as the North African army was advancing westward, the Greedy Wolf Army's 4th and 5th Corps were also advancing westward along the coastline. They acted as the reserve forces of the North African Army, ready to enter the battlefield at any time. The African war zone was going all out. Just like the Battle of Columbia that had just ended, every move by Great Xia could attract the attention of the global dynasties and become the focus of the global battlefield. This time was no exception. The happiest was, of course, Azerbaijan. In the past 3 months, they had urged Great Xia countless times, but to no avail. They waited for the stars and the moon, and finally, the Great Xia army moved. As soon as Great Xia moved, Azerbaijan saw the dawn of victory. The Egyptian army, which had endured for several months, was trapped in the south of Spain. There was a large army in front of them, and there was no food supply at the back. In June, they had to rely on the local rations to survive. Needless to say, it was very sad. If it wasn't for the tenacity of the Egyptian army, they would have collapsed. If Great Xia could conquer Algeria and Morocco, not only would they be able to cut off one of the arms of the Spanish dynasty, but they would also be able to completely unblock the logistical supply line and allow the Egyptian army to be reborn. In this way, the European battlefield would usher in a turning point. Therefore, this was a series of reactions, and the button was in the hands of Great Xia. Although it was very helpless, it was the truth. Some people were happy, and naturally, there were people who were worried. The first to bear the brunt was the Spanish dynasty. Poor Spain had just been fooled by the Dawson dynasty in South America and was forced to withdraw from the Argentine region. This made Casillas's heart bleed. The wound hadn't even scabbed, and Great Xia stabbed them in the African battlefield. This stab almost took half of Spain's life. Out of caution, Casillas left half of the 120,000 soldiers that were withdrawn from South America in the mainland, and the remaining 60,000 soldiers were sent to the African territory. In this way, the Spanish dynasty deployed 160,000 soldiers in Africa. In addition to the temporary conscription of a new army, they barely reached a scale of 200,000 soldiers. Of course, this wouldn't be able to stop the attack of the Great Xia army. Fortunately, the Great Xia army didn't seem to be too aggressive, and this made Cassius feel slightly relieved. Cassius wasn't stupid, and he wouldn't be so foolish as to think that the Great Xia army didn't attack because they were showing mercy to the Spanish dynasty. Based on Cassius's conjecture, it was more likely that Great Xia was preparing to sit on top of the mountain and reap the spoils of war from the European dynasties. They were going to be complete bystanders. This was the only way to explain it. Based on the same judgment, Henry and the others weren't in a hurry to transfer the troops stationed in the African territory to the Algerian region. Africa had never been a safe place, and they didn't dare to be careless. How could they have known that Ouyang Shua wasn't willing to be a bystander at all? Instead, he wanted to be a sh*t stirrer who would completely muddy the waters of Europe and indirectly curb the rise of Europe. This error in judgment led to a series of unforeseen events. Cassius was caught in a dilemma for a moment. Should he give up the African territory, or should he go to war with the entire country? For this reason, Cassius had no choice but to call for another summit meeting of the 6 countries. Chapter 13:11. Putting down the communication compass, Cassius's eyebrows furrowed into a line. The 3-hour summit of the 6 countries could only be summed up in one sentence. We support you in spirit. Several lords had their own thoughts. They had neither the intention nor the ability to support the Spanish dynasty. In other words, they were advising Cassius to give up the African territory for the sake of the organization, shrink the line of defense, and stabilize the rear of the European battlefield. Take a step back, said Caesar. The sea and the sky are wide. Cassius wanted to fly into a rage on the spot. These guys made it sound so easy, and it was not their interests that were harmed. There might even be people secretly gloating over his misfortune. Helpless, Cassius could only meet them and ask for some benefits. After the war, he asked to directly participate in the division of the Germanic dynasty. Otherwise, let's go our separate ways. Cassius decided to go all out. After 3 hours of wrangling, a new profit distribution agreement was finally reached. Even so, Cassius was still very unhappy. Watching the Spanish dynasty decline from prosperity to prosperity, no one would feel good, let alone someone like him who cared about his reputation. In his heart, Cassius was also increasingly unhappy with the incompetent Jack. On July 12th, the Spanish army gave up Algiers after a little resistance and retreated to the mainland. The Great Xia army in North Africa was irresistible. In the next 10 days, they were invincible. Not only did they conquer the Algerian region, but they also recovered the Moroccan region. All of North Africa was under the rule of Great Xia. Not only that, but even the other 2 territories of the Spanish dynasty in Africa, Western Sahara and Mauritania, were also included. The Spanish dynasty officially withdrew from the stage of the African continent. The base city, Morocco, and Algeria were planned by Great Xia as the province of Algiers. The provincial capital was located in Algiers, becoming the 8th province under the jurisdiction of the Protectorate of Africa. Wen Tianxiang, the former governor of Fengtian in the northern frontier province, was promoted to the governor of Algiers. Western Sahara and Mauritania were planned by Great Xia as the province of Sahara, with the provincial capital located in Nouakchott. By Nanfeng, the former governor of Tingzhou in Minnan province, was promoted to the governor of Sahara. At this point, the expansion of Great Xia on the African continent came to an end. They changed from offense to defense and managed the existing territory well. They did not think about other areas in West Africa and Central Africa for the time being. In less than 4 months, from taking over the Egyptian dynasty to conquering the Spanish dynasty in Africa, the area under the Protectorate of Africa's jurisdiction had more than doubled. If he didn't digest it properly, something big would happen. Ouyang Shua did not wish to become fat in one go. In the blink of an eye, August arrived. One of the biggest effects of the Spanish Empire's retreat was that the Egyptian army became more proactive in attacking Spain. With the support of Great Xia, the logistical problem of the Egyptian army was completely solved. With the base city, Morocco, and Atlanta City, they formed an iron triangle. Great Xia completely controlled the lifeline of the Mediterranean Sea, the Strait of Gibraltar. Whether the three allied fleets could enter the Atlantic Ocean depended on Great Xia's mood, not to mention interfering with Great Xia's supplies. The Mediterranean Sea route was completely under the control of Great Xia. What made the Silver Hand feel a little relieved was that on the day of the establishment of the Algiers province, Great Xia issued a brief announcement reiterating the maintenance of global free trade. In other words, Great Xia would not rely on the Strait of Gibraltar to interfere with merchant ships along the route. Ships traveling to and from the Mediterranean Sea route, whether they were from Great Xia, the Azure Emblem, or even the Silver Hand, could freely travel through the Suez Canal and the Strait of Gibraltar. The Mediterranean Sea route would only be more open and safer than before. Ouyang Shuo still upheld the concept of a win-win situation. He didn't want to go too far. A corner dog would jump over a wall. The Mediterranean Sea route was the main sea artery of Asia, Europe, and Africa. It was not only related to the interests of the dynasties along the Mediterranean Sea, but also implicated Great Xia, India, Persia, and Arabia. Even the Gangdur dynasty, the Germanic dynasty, the Romanov dynasty, and the Dawson dynasty had merchant ships shuttling through the Mediterranean Sea. If Great Xia really ran amok and monopolized the Mediterranean Sea, it would become the target of public criticism. Wouldn't that give the Azure Emblem and the Silver Hand the best reason to unite against Great Xia? Ouyang Shuo was not so stupid. Moreover, Great Xia was also the biggest beneficiary of the opening of the route. If Great Xia wanted to become an imperial dynasty in the future, the third condition was to obtain the recognition of the global dynasties. If one wanted to become a global hegemon, they first had to take on global responsibilities. In history, after the end of World War II, the United States quickly rose to become a global hegemon, playing the role of global policeman. Most importantly, the United States took on many international responsibilities. This was undeniable. Who knew how many countries and international organizations had received aid from the United States? Although this aid was not free, and some of it had ulterior motives, in reality, it still promoted the reconstruction of the post-war countries and confirmed the new post-war order. This was also undeniable. In the later stages, the United States had internal problems and was no longer willing to take on global responsibilities. While pursuing isolationism, it also lost its position as a global hegemon. This was very realistic. Power and responsibility were often two sides of the same coin. Taking history as a lesson, Ouyang Shuo used the United States of that time as a model. Naturally, he couldn't be foolish and do something like blocking the Mediterranean Sea at this time. On the contrary, Ouyang Shuo wanted to make use of this opportunity to vigorously promote global free trade. Even with the Panama Canal, which had just been conquered, Ouyang Shuo was not prepared to interfere with the free travel of the Dawson dynasty's caravans. He only needed to accept the routine inspection of Great Xia and pay a customs fee. This could be considered a form of covert infiltration. This way, while allowing Great Xia to develop, it could also, to a certain extent, build a closer relationship with the other dynasties, laying a foundation for the future elimination of the two major organizations. Otherwise, why would they abandon their original organizations? There was another reason why the Egyptian army suddenly increased their offensive. Ouyang Shuo had set a deadline. Back then, when the Azure Emblem signed the agreement with Great Xia to cede the Egyptian dynasty, it stated that Great Xia would be responsible for the logistics of the Egyptian army, but there was a time limit. They couldn't say that Great Xia would be responsible to the end if the Egyptian army did not make any contributions at the front lines. Wouldn't that be a huge loss? The logistics of the 500,000 Egyptian army would empty out the entire African protectorate of Great Xia. The deadline that Ouyang Shuo had set was the end of the 8th year of Gaia. If the 8th year of Gaia ended and the two sides were still in a deadlock, then sorry, the Egyptian army would have to fend for themselves. It was already August, and winter was about to arrive. Although the Spanish dynasty was affected by the Mediterranean Sea and was temperate, it would still be affected a little. At the very least, it wouldn't be easy to gather provisions. Thus, there wasn't much time left for the Egyptian army. They had to achieve a decisive result on the battlefield in Spain before the 8th year of Gaia ended. This was easier said than done. The Spanish dynasty, which had completely shrunk, had gathered nearly 320,000 soldiers. Coupled with the geographical advantage, they weren't afraid of the Egyptian army at all. Both sides could only be considered evenly matched. The variables were outside the battlefield. It all depended on how the Azure emblem operated. Chapter 13:12. On August 5th, the Azure badge, which had been forced into a desperate situation, finally broke out. Compared to the Silver Hand, the Azure badge's power was still too scattered. Although its tentacles were all over the world, it was unable to form a joint force. Among the 5 dynasties, except for the Germanic dynasty, there was no other dynasty that could do anything. Unlike the Silver Hand, its forces were spread out in large numbers. It was fine before, but once it fell into a global war, the weakness of the Azure badge was infinitely magnified. Even if it made a deal with Great Xia, it would not be able to reverse the situation. It was a temporary solution. If the Azure badge wanted to reverse the war in Europe, it had to destroy at least one of the 5 allied dynasties in order to break the balance of power. Otherwise, it would be a trapped beast. Seeing that there was not much time left, the Azure badge had no choice but to play its strongest trump card. Almost on the same day, large-scale riots suddenly broke out in the territories of the Ganger dynasty, the Gaul dynasty, the Spanish dynasty, the Caesar dynasty, and the Romanov dynasty. There were assassinations of officials, fires, dams breaking, or small-scale uprisings. Under the instigation of the Azure badge, the secret members lurking in the 5 dynasties did not hesitate to risk exposure to make a mess of the 5 dynasties. This was called fighting behind the enemy's back. For the Azure badge, the price of doing so was huge. From now on, they would completely lose influence over the 5 dynasties, and all secret members would be swept away by the enemy. The huge price paid was also significant. The sudden chaos caused the 5 dynasties that were focused on the front line to panic. The ones affected the most were the Spanish dynasty and the Gaul dynasty. Needless to say, the Spanish dynasty. They were already fighting with the Egyptian army. Suddenly, there was a fire in their backyard, the morale of the army was unstable, and the grain route was also disrupted. This allowed the Egyptian army to seize the opportunity and quickly advance from the south to the north. By mid-August, only half of the Spanish dynasty's territory was left. The former Portuguese region, except for the northern corner, had basically fallen, and the situation was very miserable. The second most unlucky was the Gaul dynasty. The Gaul dynasty was at the front line. After the Egyptian army landed in Spain, the Germanic dynasty changed its strategy and chose to defend the Gaul dynasty's side. The other 2 sides were mainly for passive defense of the city. The Germanic army on the west side adopted an active defense strategy, and sometimes even attacked instead of defending. As a result, the border cities of the Gaul dynasty were inevitably dragged into the flames of war. Between the 2 dynasties, there was a vast expanse of flat land. The disturbance this time was undoubtedly one disaster after another for Gaul. On the 15th of August, the Egyptian army finally reached the walls of Madrid. Madrid was located in the center of Spain. Although it was not the capital of the Spanish dynasty, it was the royal city of the Spanish district and the largest city of the Spanish dynasty. Once Madrid fell, the northern part of Spain would be a piece of flat land without any barriers. Casillas finally panicked. At this time, Casillas no longer cared about the overall situation or the opposition of Henry and the others. He resolutely ordered Bloody Butcher Fernando to lead his troops back to the mainland. The stalemate on the European battlefield was finally broken. Without the Spanish army, the Allies would lose an arm, and their chances of victory would be reduced by 20%. At this moment, the Germanic dynasty unexpectedly sent a troop of 100,000 people to cross the English Channel and land on the homeland of the Ganger dynasty. Even William, who had always been calm, panicked for a moment. The European battlefield was ushering in a new turning point. Steel-Tud Empire, Castle Avik. William's face was full of worry. Although he still maintained the demeanor of a noble, he could not give people strength. Annie, who was sitting opposite William, saw this and asked, "Brother, do you want to transfer some troops from the front line back to defend? The Germanic army is burning and looting along the coast. We must quickly quell it." No. Compared to Cassius, William seemed more rational. "If we withdraw now, the war in Europe will be abandoned halfway, and it will be extremely difficult to organize again. So be it." Annie, however, had a different understanding. "Brother, I don't understand. Why we have to fight to the death with the Azure Badge? We are fighting to the death in Europe, while the Xia dynasty and the Dawson dynasty are on the sidelines, reaping the benefits. Don't you think this is very stupid?" "What do you know?" William's face darkened. "As long as we conquer the Germanic dynasty and unify Europe, the organization will be able to occupy two continents, North America and Europe, and remain the strongest existence in the world." "Unify Europe?" Annie's face showed a mocking expression. "Brother, don't tell me you don't know what those guys from Caesar are thinking. Greed is hard to satisfy. Not to mention that it is very difficult to conquer the Germanic dynasty now. Even if we do, I dare to bet that they will start fighting among themselves." Hearing this, William's expression was complicated and unpredictable. In the end, it turned into a sigh, and he said firmly, "No matter what, we can't withdraw at this time. Even if the situation you mention happens, it will be an internal conflict of the organization." Annie shook her head in disappointment. "Brother, think about it. Before working for the organization, you are first and foremost the king of the Gangster dynasty. This is the root of the family." With that, Annie got up and left the study. The capital, just as the Azure Badge was suddenly stirring up a storm in the European battlefield and gradually turning the tide, as the special representative of the Azure Badge, Elder Chun, once again visited the Xia dynasty. Old Chun was here to discuss a business deal. Although the Germanic dynasty launched a counterattack against the Gangster dynasty, it was just a cover-up. The purpose was to warn the opponent. The Germanic dynasty is far from falling. It would be best if the Gangster dynasty could retreat in the face of difficulties. Unexpectedly, William was very calm and did not waver at all. While arranging the local army to fight against the invading troops, he continued to send provisions and supplies to the Gaul dynasty. This was difficult. The Germanic dynasty, which was about to be hollowed out, really did not want to continue fighting. But they had to fight. In order to transfuse blood for the Germanic dynasty, the Azure Badge also put in a lot of effort. They raised a total of 40 million gold coins and placed a shocking firearms order with the Xia dynasty. More than half of the funds came from the Germanic dynasty. How could Ouyang Shuo refuse when there was money to be made? He immediately agreed and signed a formal agreement. Supporting the Germanic dynasty was in line with the current strategy of the Xia dynasty. In addition to firearms, the Germanic dynasty also placed an order for tens of millions of gold coins for war supplies. Ouyang Shuo also accepted it readily. With the restoration of the Mediterranean Sea route, with the sea transportation capacity of the Xia dynasty, these war supplies could be very easily transported from the Xia dynasty to the European continent. With 2 orders, the Xia dynasty earned another 50 million gold coins. In addition to the previous firearms order, in just 1 year, more than 100 million gold coins flowed into the Xia dynasty. The gold coin reserves of the Xia dynasty had reached an unprecedented figure. Ouyang Shuo did not intend to let these gold coins flow into the market. They were all cast into gold bricks and deposited in the vault of the Xia dynasty bank as strategic reserves. At present, within the Xia dynasty dollar was the main currency for transactions. In the future, if the Xia dynasty dollar wanted to go international and become the strongest currency in the world, the premise was that the Xia dynasty itself had enough gold reserves. Otherwise, the global credibility of the Xia dynasty dollar could not be established at all. Chapter 13:13 Before Old Chen left, Ouyang Shua asked, Azure Emblem also has secret members in Great Xia, right? Old Chen didn't know how to answer. Ouyang Shua smiled and said, if Azure Emblem can provide me with a list, there is still a chance for further cooperation. After all, no one wants to have a bunch of time bombs around them, right? Azure Emblem stirred up a storm in Europe and let the world see their hidden power. This naturally aroused the vigilance of Ouyang Shua, Jack, and other big shots. This was also one of the repercussions. In comparison, Ouyang Shua was less worried about the secret members of Azure Emblem than Jack. First, Battle Wolf, as a former core member of Azure Emblem, provided a list of the organization's members after joining Great Xia. Ouyang Shua held the list in his hand and only let the Mountain Sea Guards monitor it. The second was the Mountain Sea Guards. With the surveillance of this secret organization, coupled with the cooperation of the martial arts department and various levels of bailiffs, it would be fine if the secret members of Azure Emblem were not exposed, but once they were exposed, it would be difficult to cause any big waves. Of course, it would be best if they could eliminate the hidden dangers. I will try my best to mediate and make this happen, Old Chun stated clearly. Ouyang Shua nodded in satisfaction and reiterated, Old Chun, the previous invitation is still valid. I will consider it. Old Chun didn't directly refuse this time. Regardless of whether Azure Emblem could protect the Germanic Empire this time, there was no place for Old Chun. On the contrary, Great Xia was like the sun in the sky, and there was a place for Old Chun. For Old Chun, the choice was just a hurdle. Once he crossed it, the world would be wide open. Time flew, and the tense month of August flashed by. Looking at the world, one would find a very interesting thing. If the global map was centered on Great Xia, the European and North American continents on both sides of Great Xia would be filled with smoke, forming a sharp contrast with the calm Great Xia. At the same time, the African continent to the south of Europe and the South American continent to the south of North America had established a new order due to the strong intervention of Great Xia. The shadow of Great Xia shrouded the world. With such a comparison, one could see the advantages of Great Xia. With the help of a few orders for extremely expensive firearms, a stable internal environment, and abundant natural resources, Great Xia's economy was experiencing the greatest growth since its founding, and its industrialization was progressing at a tremendous pace. Whether it was the mainland, southern border, Africa, or South America, they were all developing rapidly and complementing each other. In the long run, they would be able to leave the other dynasties far behind. One thing that couldn't be ignored was that in this global war, there were three dynasties that relied on their unique geographical locations to stay out of the war. They were the Bantu Empire in the south of Africa, as well as the Persian Empire and the Arab Empire in Asia. What Ouyang Shua feared the most was the neighbor to the west, the Persian Empire. The Bantu Empire was content in a corner, and the north was blocked by two powerful enemies, the Xia Empire and Dawson Empire. It would be difficult for them to do anything else, so it should be a backup base for the Azure Emblem. The Arabian Empire and the Persian Empire both had a strong religious atmosphere, and they were two empires that were relatively difficult to conquer. If it weren't for the differences in religion, the two empires might even join forces. Compared to the Persian Empire, the biggest weakness of the Arab Empire was that other than oil, natural gas, and other energy resources, it was hard to get any other decent resources. Coal and iron were basic industrial resources. With paint resources but no ore resources, the Arabian Empire's road to industrialization would not work. Moreover, the Arabian Empire was covered with deserts of all sizes, and the only areas that were suitable for living were the Mediterranean coast, the Persian Gulf coast, the Red Sea coast, and the Arabian Sea coast. This greatly limited the rise of the Arabian Empire. The Arabian Empire had an astonishing reserve of oil and gas resources, and it was difficult to judge whether it was a blessing or a curse. On the other hand, the Persian Empire had all the resources for industrialization and was one of the potential rivals of the Xia Empire to dominate Asia. Between the two, there was still an old debt that had not been settled. The Wokuatai tribe was still living comfortably in the Persian Empire. In the past 6 months, under the joint efforts of the people of the Western Border and the Western Border Construction Corps, the food reserves of the Western Border Province had gradually reached a certain scale, and they were preparing for the war next year. There would be a war in the West. There was one place that had to be mentioned in the global war, and that was the Indian District. Since the beginning of spring, the civil war in the Indian District had been in full swing. Under the joint attack of the Peacock Dynasty and the Guddo Dynasty, the Ashoka Dynasty had been beaten back. More than half a year had passed, and the Ashoka Dynasty had lost nearly half of its territory, and its army had also suffered heavy losses. Fortunately, the Ashoka Dynasty had a deep foundation, sufficient provisions, and King Ashoka was also a lord who refused to admit defeat. Otherwise, he would not have fought with the Xia Empire in the Tubo battlefield. Even so, there was no way to reverse the situation. Judging from the current trend, if the two dynasties were to go all out, it was very likely that they would join forces to destroy the Ashoka Dynasty before winter and achieve the goal of dividing India. If that was really the case, it would be greatly disadvantageous to the strategy of the Xia Empire. A stable and united Indian district was not in the interest of the Xia Empire. Although the chaotic war for more than half a year had greatly consumed the overall national strength of the Indian district, but with a huge population base, the two dynasties would soon be able to get on the right track. By then, it would definitely become the biggest obstacle to the Xia Empire dominating Asia, and the degree of threat even exceeded that of the Persian Empire. This was what Ouyang Shua did not want to see. Fortunately, as early as the end of last year, Ouyang Shua had buried a hidden mine. Now it was time to use it. The 5th day of the 9th month of the 8th year of Gaia, the capital. In September, the capital was extraordinarily lively, especially the newly built university district, which was welcoming a batch of new students. Outstanding students from the various provinces of the empire had passed through layers of examinations, stood out, and were able to further their studies in the capital. They were the future of the empire. The education system of the Xia Empire was improving day by day, and top talents could also be produced from poor families. Other than the Capital Normal University and the Capital Normal University, there were also the Imperial University of Science and Technology and the Capital Academy of Arts for students to choose from. The newly established Imperial University of Science and Technology, in particular, became even more popular with a wave of industrialization. In the imperial study of the palace, Ouyang Shua summoned the military minister Du Ruhui and the chamberlain of dependencies, Zhang Yi. They were discussing the strategy of India. In the next few days, request the chamberlain of dependencies to send a secret envoy to the Ashoka dynasty, Ouyang Shua said. Zhang Yi heard this and asked, "May I ask your majesty, what is the mission of the envoy?" "Tell the Ashoka that as long as they pay a generous ransom, we are willing to return the 1 million soldiers of the Ashoka dynasty unharmed." Ouyang Shua revealed the mystery. In the Tubo War, the Great Xia captured a huge army of 1 million soldiers of the Ashoka dynasty. They were all detained and requisitioned to build the two highways of the Sichuan-Tibet line and the Qingzhong line. As of today, the construction of the two roads had basically been completed, and they were almost finished. In this process, the 1 million prisoners of war played a very important role and could be regarded as indispensable. Ouyang Shua was not a tyrant. He specifically ordered that these prisoners of war must not be beaten or scolded at will, and that their food and drink must be guaranteed. When they were sick, they also had to be responsible for treatment. In short, apart from not having a salary, their treatment was not much different from that of ordinary laborers. After more than half a year, the 1 million prisoners of war did not decrease much. Du Ruhui's eyes lit up when he heard this. "Your Majesty wants to strengthen the strength of the Ashoka dynasty and let the civil war in India continue." This was in line with the strategy of the Great Xia. Ouyang Shua nodded, the corners of his mouth revealing a smile. "I really want to know when the Peacock dynasty and the Ashoka dynasty are preparing to take down the Ashoka dynasty in one go, but suddenly discover that the Ashoka dynasty suddenly has an army of 1 million soldiers. What interesting things will happen?" It must be very interesting. Duruhue smiled in agreement. The Chamberlain of Dependencies will be responsible for the matter of the envoy. The handover of the prisoners of war will be planned by the Bureau of Military Affairs. Remember, do a good job of confidentiality. Do not let the Peacock dynasty and the Godot dynasty know. Yes. Duruhue and Zhang Yi nodded in response. Chapter 13-14. Just as Ouyang Shua had expected, Ashoka gladly accepted the olive branch extended by Great Xia. After some discussion, the two sides finally agreed that the Ashoka dynasty would pay a ransom of 30 million gold coins for all the captives. It had to be said that the Ashoka dynasty was truly rich. The agreement had, to a certain extent, eased the tense atmosphere between the two dynasties. King Ashoka even took the initiative to suggest that limited trade could be carried out at the border. The internal war must have put the Ashoka dynasty's material reserves to the test. Although Ouyang Shua didn't refuse, he wasn't very enthusiastic about it. The Ashoka dynasty couldn't afford to pay the high cost of transporting the materials from the Central Plains to the border of Shikong province. The symbolic meaning of trade was greater than the practical meaning. Of course, Great Xia could also use the name of trade to more conveniently infiltrate the Ashoka dynasty. In the next month, under the organization of the Privy Council, the 1 million captives were sent back to the Ashoka dynasty in an orderly and secret manner. After receiving the captives, it would take at least a month for the Ashoka dynasty to recover. This also meant that these captives couldn't solve the Ashoka dynasty's urgent problem. In the next 2 months, the Ashoka dynasty would still have to resist. In the blink of an eye, it was already October. After 2 months of fierce fighting, the global battlefield finally changed. The first to break the stalemate was the North American battlefield. Although they had purchased firearms and the help of Great Xia's mercenaries, the Maple dynasty was still being beaten back by the Dawson dynasty's crazy attack. In the end, the Dawson dynasty invested millions of soldiers in the Maple dynasty's battlefield. In order to destroy the Maple dynasty, the Dawson dynasty didn't even hesitate to shrink their defensive line in Africa. They wanted to get rid of this hidden danger in one fell swoop. Otherwise, the Dawson dynasty would never be able to break out. Jack was anxious. Aside from wanting to solve the terrible situation of the Dawson dynasty, there was another reason. The stalemate in Europe was very disadvantageous to the Silver Hand. As the banner of the Silver Hand, the Dawson dynasty had to contribute to the European battlefield. Before that, they had to completely destroy the Maple dynasty at all costs so that they wouldn't fall into the predicament of fighting on multiple fronts. For this reason, Jack showed his resolute side. On the 10th of October, under the fierce attack of the Dawson dynasty's army, the capital of the Maple dynasty, Quebec City, finally fell. This basically announced the fall of the Maple dynasty. Prior to this, the capital city of the Canada region, Ottawa, had already been conquered by the Dawson dynasty. At the last moment, the rest of the Great Xia mercenary First Army covered the royal family members and the core ministers of the Maple Leaf dynasty and boarded the warships of the Atlantic Fleet, successfully escaping from the Maple Leaf dynasty. They would disembark at the Columbia province under the Great Xia Protectorate of America, and then be teleported to the capital to accept the protection of Great Xia, which was also the only Lord dynasty in the world to seek protection. Of course, protection was just a euphemism. No matter if it was the royal family of the Maple Leaf dynasty or Ouyang Shua, they would never mention rebuilding the Maple Leaf dynasty again. That was unrealistic. After conquering the Maple Leaf dynasty, the Dawson dynasty had essentially unified North America. October 11th, the day after the Dawson dynasty conquered the Maple dynasty, a system announcement spread throughout the world, greatly boosting the morale of the Silver Hands camp. World announcement. Congratulations to player Jack of the American server for successfully transforming the Dawson dynasty into the Dawson Empire, becoming the second lord in the entire world to ascend to the throne. Special reward: 2 Homo sapiens, 6 million gold coins, and a mysterious gift. 1 year and 10 months after the Great Xia became a dynasty, the second dynasty finally appeared in the world, establishing the status and influence of the Daosan Empire in the entire world. The one who felt the most was Ouyang Shua. After the Daosan dynasty became a dynasty, Ouyang Shua discovered to his astonishment that the Daosan Empire would very likely surpass the Daosan dynasty and become the first imperial dynasty in the world. Condition 1. Unify the American server. This condition had been fulfilled long ago in the Daosan dynasty. Condition 2. Become the hegemon of the Northern American server. Once the Daosan dynasty unified North America, it would naturally become the hegemon. Condition 3. Gain the recognition of the dynasties all over the world. As the flag of the silver hand, compared to the Great Xia, the Daosan dynasty had a natural advantage in terms of global influence. It was easier for them to gain the recognition of the dynasties all over the world. How could Ouyang Shua not feel a sense of urgency? Right now, the Great Xia dynasty hadn't even fulfilled the second condition. The Daosan dynasty, which was consolidating its own backyard, would no longer keep a low profile and provoke the Great Xia to expand its global influence. Ouyang Shua's prediction soon became reality. On October 15th, the Daosan dynasty, which had just become a dynasty, immediately declared war on the Mayan dynasty. They even said that sooner or later, they would take back the Panama Canal and compete with the Great Xia. The situation in the American server had changed. It could be predicted that now that the Daosan dynasty had broken away from the war in both the north and the south, the Mayan dynasty, which had a poor geographical location and didn't have many resources, would face many challenges. Because of this, Ouyang Shua didn't hesitate at all. He immediately ordered the mercenary corps in the Columbia province to immediately head to the Mayan dynasty and continue to fight against the overbearing Daosan dynasty. The Mayan dynasty, which was in deep crisis, needed a force like this. The two sides hit it off. Ouyang Shua's strategy was to delay the Daosan dynasty as much as possible so that they wouldn't have the energy to intervene in the European battlefield. The longer the war dragged on, the more advantageous it would be for the Great Xia. In the end, Ouyang Shua didn't fear the Daosan dynasty at all. The Maple dynasty had delayed the Daosan dynasty for nearly a year, causing the Daosan dynasty to suffer a huge blow. If they were to reappear in the Mayan battlefield, Ouyang Shua wanted to see what the Daosan dynasty would use to fight against the Great Xia. Deep down, Ouyang Shua no longer viewed the Daosan dynasty as an opponent on the same level as him. In the entire world, only the Silver Hand could truly fight against the Great Xia. Even the Azure Emblem was already declining and couldn't stand on equal footing with the Great Xia. The loss of the Maple dynasty was a heavy blow to the Azure Emblem's global strategy. If the Mayan dynasty fell into the hands of the Daosan dynasty, then in the entire world, the Azure Emblem only had the Germanic dynasty, the Banto dynasty, and the Guder dynasty in the Indian region. This was very embarrassing. Because of this, the Azure Emblem had to adopt a more proactive strategy. In addition to actively cooperating with the Great Xia in the Mayan battlefield, they also created waves in the African continent. October 16th, the day after the Daosan dynasty declared war on the Mayan dynasty, the Banto dynasty changed their previous defensive strategy and went north to attack the Daosan dynasty's Central African territory. The African continent, which had been peaceful for a while, was once again filled with smoke. Chapter 13:15. The Maya dynasty was the buffer zone between the Daosan dynasty and the Xia dynasty. Now that the Daosan dynasty was in a hurry to attack the Maya dynasty, it was inevitable that they would clash with the Xia dynasty. The only thing Ouyang Shua could do was to use the Maya dynasty as a medium to suppress the Daosan dynasty. On the African continent, the Banto dynasty attacked the Daosan dynasty's Central African territory in an attempt to suppress the Daosan dynasty while expanding their influence in Africa. Right now, the Xia dynasty's position in the African protectorate was unshakable. Below them was the Banto dynasty, and finally the European and American dynasties. The Banto dynasty was waiting for an opportunity to make a move which would affect the Xia dynasty's strategy in Africa. Therefore, the global situation was complicated, and the only thing that drove each other was their own interests. The Xia dynasty and the Azure emblem were not allies. They were using each other. If there was a chance, they would even stab each other in the back. The global situation was treacherous. Under such circumstances, the preparations for the First Kingdom Games in the Xia dynasty were in full swing. The gymnasium had been completed and was officially put into use. Thousands of athletes from the 19 provinces and the 5 protectorates had arrived in the capital to familiarize themselves with the venue and make the final preparations. Compared to the games in real life, the number of athletes was a bit smaller. Because there were too few events, it couldn't be compared to reality. Even so, as long as they had a good start, the future would only get more and more spectacular. It could even be said that it was possible to organize a global sports event. This was also a way to spread the Xia dynasty's influence. October 10th, the capital, Di Chun, who had just returned from North America, was summoned by the emperor again. Ouyang Shuo was satisfied with Di Chun's trip to North America. This time, he was summoned for a new mission. Ouyang Shuo said, the imperial court is going to set up a special trade negotiation team to mediate the Pacific trade. The main participants include the Indian Empire, the Dawson Dynasty, and the Dark Knight Empire. In the past half a year, because of the rise of the Dark Knight Empire, the trade in the Pacific had not been peaceful. The Dark Knight Empire often caused disturbances to the merchant ships traveling between the Xia Dynasty and South America. There were even a few incidents where merchant ships were sunk, which affected the safety of the shipping routes. Ouyang Shuo was not afraid of trouble. He immediately ordered the Pacific Fleet to disrupt the trade between the Dark Knight Empire and the Dawson Dynasty. Although they didn't sink the merchant ships, they did seize a few. An eye for an eye. As more and more ironclad warships joined the Pacific Fleet, the current strength of the Pacific Fleet was already on par with the Dark Knight Fleet. Even if it was a head-on clash, he wasn't afraid at all. Not long ago, the two fleets had a confrontation in the waters near the Hawaiian Islands. The Pacific Fleet gave the Dark Knight Fleet a good beating, which had already proved this point. Although the warships of the Dark Knight Fleet were not bad, in terms of the overall level of naval warfare, they could not be compared to the Great Xia Pacific Fleet, which had been active in the Pacific Ocean for several years. After this battle, the Dark Knight Empire became much more restrained. Not only did they no longer harass the merchant ships traveling through the Pacific Ocean, they even stopped harassing the coastal areas of southern border. The Dark Knight Empire, led by Keisuke Honda, was indeed a bunch of despicable wretches who were used to bullying the weak. Once they faced an opponent that was stronger than them, they would immediately admit defeat and behave obediently. Even then, Ouyang Shuo wouldn't underestimate this opponent. The Great Xia had benefited from this global war, but so had the Dark Knight Empire. Every time a dynasty fell, a group of non-humans would choose to go to the legendary trial grounds. The current master of Motherland, the Dark Knight Empire, had settled there. This had indirectly increased the population of the Dark Knight Empire, and this trend would continue. Moreover, this trend would continue. Relying on its natural geographical advantage, the Dark Knight Empire would evolve into the largest gathering place for those who perished. No matter which dynasty fell, the Dark Knight Empire would easily get a share of the pie. The Dark Knight Empire occupied a continent far away from Eurasia and Africa. It wasn't even connected to the American continent. The motherland also had good plains and rich resources. It was similar to the American cable network in history. It wouldn't be too much to treat such an opponent seriously. Ouyang Shuo's strategy was to maintain a strong position against the Dark Knight Empire. Only then could he suppress the Dark Knight Empire and isolate it in the future. Before that, Ouyang Shuo had to manage the Pacific Ocean route well. After the establishment of the American Protectorate, the connection between the Great Xia Empire and the American continent had become closer. They needed a safe and reliable route. Although the Dark Knight Empire had stopped fighting, it didn't mean they wouldn't attack again. Ouyang Shuo stood on a new strategic level and made a suggestion, which was to invite the Dawson Empire, the Dark Knight Empire, and the Indian Empire to hold a four-party discussion. The four dynasties could oppose each other, or even view each other as enemies, but they all had the responsibility to maintain the safety of the Pacific Ocean route. No matter which dynasty it was, they were not allowed to send their fleets to disturb the merchant ships. Politics is politics. Economics is economics. Ouyang Shuo was planning to use this method to solve the trade problem in the Pacific Ocean. He didn't believe that Jack and the others were fools. A safe Pacific Ocean route was in the interest of all parties. You'll be in charge of diplomatic affairs. Is there a problem? Ouyang Shuo asked Di Chun. Di Chun naturally understood the importance of this trade negotiation team to the empire. Breaking the ice between the Dawson Empire and the Dark Knight Empire was a very challenging task. Thinking of this, Di Chun felt a bit excited. His blood, which had cooled down long ago, began to boil again. It had been a long time since Di Chun felt so excited. He nodded solemnly and said, "Your Majesty, don't worry. I will handle this matter perfectly." Ouyang Shuo smiled and promised, "If this matter is successful, I will make you a marquis of the third rank." Right now, Di Chun was just a count of the first rank. If he could be promoted to a marquis, it would be a qualitative leap in his power. This was very important to Di Chun and the Di clan. This was a huge reward. More importantly, once Di Chun was promoted, it would send a message to the entire court that Di Chun had gained the trust of His Majesty. This was even more important than the promotion of his marquis. As the publicly acknowledged enemy of His Majesty, Di Chun's situation in the empire wasn't very good. Not to mention his influence in the court, he was even isolated in the Chamberlain of Dependencies. This was because the officials were sure that Di Chun wasn't trusted by His Majesty. This was enough to make Di Chun unable to move a single step in the empire. During this period of time, although Di Chun often went out and did a few errands for the empire, he couldn't help but feel a bit miserable. Ouyang Shuo's promise completely shattered Di Chun's psychological defense. Chapter 13:16. Thank you, Your Majesty. I will do my best to repay Your Majesty's kindness. Di Chun solemnly bowed, a trace of tears in the corner of his eyes. The feeling of being valued was too precious. From now on, Di Chun's path would be boundless. Ouyang Shuo smiled. Don't forget, we are all descendants of Huaxia. We are one family. Yes, one family. Di Chun sighed. At this moment, he had completely let go of the knot in his heart and completely integrated with his new role. The two former enemies looked at each other and smiled. October was the golden autumn. It was the harvest season. Ouyang Shuo was most concerned about the situation of the Northern Plains, Western Frontier, Western Kong, and the four major construction corps in Australia. After nearly a year of hard work, the four major construction corps had opened up nearly 10 million mu of farmland, forest, or pastures. Many semi-military farms were erected, bringing vitality to the desolate border. The newly built granaries were gradually filling up. At the same time, using the rich mineral resources of the western region, the Privy Council set up a number of munitions factories nearby. A large number of weapons and equipment were produced on assembly lines in preparation for the war next year. The border that had been silent for nearly a year had the conditions to start a war again. Because of this, Ouyang Shuo asked the Chamberlain of Dependencies to issue an ultimatum to the Persian Empire. The Persian Empire had to hand over the Okodai tribe before the end of the 8th year of Gaia. Otherwise, they would meet on the battlefield. Ouyang Shuo's words were tough, and he was determined to fight. He wanted to use this opportunity to pressure the Persian Empire and make strategic preparations for the Persian Gulf oil field. Ouyang Shuo had to suppress this threatening neighbor. The Persian Empire, no matter what. Persian Empire, Tehran. The Persian king was in a difficult position after receiving the ultimatum from Great Xia. Although he knew that this day would come, it was hard to make a decision. Expelling the Okodai tribe could exchange for a short period of peace. If they did not expel the Okodai tribe, war might come to the Persian Empire in spring next year. Like Great Xia, the Persian Empire was making full use of the rare period of peace to advance on the road of industrialization. Some of the firearms of the European Allied forces were exported by the Persian Empire. Once war broke out with Great Xia, this rare situation would definitely be broken. This would slow down or even stop the industrialization that they had painstakingly developed. This was unacceptable to the Persian king. The problem was that it would be a great humiliation to the Persian Empire if they were to hand over the Ajadai tribe just like that. The Persian Empire would probably find it hard to accept, and it would affect the morale of the army. I have to think of a way that satisfies both sides. The king of Persia murmured to himself, his eyes gleaming with wisdom. The capital. In October, the Great Xia dynasty had launched the largest reorganization of government offices since the beginning of spring. It had finally come to an end, and all the provinces had completed the restructuring of the third-level organizations. The turbulent situation began to gradually stabilize, and even more energy burst forth. The War Preparedness Division of the Privy Council was also nearing the end of the construction of the 8 logistics support centers. Around the central headquarters, a group of cities quietly rose, becoming important military towns. The moment the logistics support center was built, half of the empire's civilians' war labor was directly cut. After the expansion of the martial arts department, it quickly began to operate. Its tentacles were spread across the various provinces, implementing full coverage, supervision, and guidance for all the warriors within the borders of the empire. The most obvious effect was that the crime rate in the empire dropped by 20%. All in all, the grand strategy formulated by the imperial court before the new year was being finalized. For the Great Xia, the year of Gaia was a year of great harvest. Although it was not outstanding, the overall strength of the country had risen to a new level, making people look at them in a different light. On the 20th of October, the first power plant of the Great Xia dynasty was built in the western suburbs of the capital and was officially put into use. The city of the capital was lit up for the first time. To the Great Xia dynasty, this was of great significance. Ouyang Shua even personally attended the electrification ceremony, lighting up the first street lamp in the capital. The electric era had quietly arrived. To the players like Ouyang Shua, this scene was both familiar and strange. In the real world, the incandescent light bulb had long been eliminated and appeared in the game world. In this world where martial arts and technology coexisted, it was a little strange and dazzling. Ouyang Shua thought of an adjective, the steampunk era. It was a fantasy era with modern technology mixed with mysterious powers. To the players, this should be the best era. They could enjoy the various conveniences brought about by modern technology, and they could walk further on the path of individual evolution. Humans and technology were in harmony. It was not like the real world, where as technology advanced, humans were degenerating. Ouyang Shua liked this era. On the 1st of November, the capital, at 9 o'clock in the morning, the grand opening of the empire's first sports competition was held. Ouyang Shua attended the opening ceremony and gave a passionate speech. For the first time, he proposed a national fitness program, including the health of the people into the highest decision-making plan of the empire. After that, the Royal Drama Troupe, the Royal Art Troupe, and other top art troupes of the empire presented an exciting opening performance for the tens of thousands of spectators. The essence of the Chinese culture was vividly displayed. For the next half a month, the capital would be in a carnival because of this grand event. Thousands of athletes would fight for the championship and shed their blood. The first batch of sports records of the empire would also be recorded in the history books. Outside of the Great Xia dynasty, due to the approaching winter, the chaotic war on the global scale entered a rare period of rest. The various battlefields gradually became quiet. Both warring parties were making use of the precious rest period to recharge their strength and replenish their rations. For example, the Germanic Empire would make use of the winter to recruit soldiers again. The current peace was just a prelude to another major outbreak. Ouyang Shua predicted that in the 9 years of Gaia, war would still be the main theme of the world. Only when this wave of war ended and the global situation ushered in a new phase could there be peace. A short period of peace. Based on Gaia's intentions, there would be no true peace in the game world, unless there was a super empire that unified the entire world. But this was very difficult. Even someone as confident as Ouyang Shua didn't think that the Great Xia dynasty had the ability to do so. In the last week before winter, the Pacific trade rules proposed by the Great Xia dynasty finally received the response of the Dawson dynasty, the Dark Knight Empire, and the Indian Empire. The four parties began their talks. In the next few months, the representatives of the four parties would carry out rounds of discussions on the specific agreements. The reason why it took so long was because the four parties didn't trust each other. This was destined to be a bumpy road of negotiations. Di Chun was appointed by Ouyang Shua as the leader of the Great Xia dynasty's negotiation team and was fully responsible for this matter. From this moment on, Di Chun was truly accepted by the Great Xia dynasty. You're tuning in to the Warrior Lore YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.